Committee's 10th meeting. Thank you again for your commitment to Texas and for your leadership as we work together to provide coordinating board's advice and recommendations regarding the development of the next long-term strategic plan for Texas higher education. We've been working to develop a strategic plan that inspires and advances student success, and a plan that will help position Texas as a leader in an increasingly complex world economy. Thank you again to those of you who moderated panels and facilitated workshops at the 2014 Texas Higher Education Leadership Conference. And thanks also to those of you who attended. The panels were videotaped, and the coordinating board's technical staff has uploaded the edited videos onto the conference website, link to which you can see on the welcome slide displayed. For our meeting today, each of you has a folder containing the agenda of today's meeting, the minutes from our meeting on January 14th, the biography of Dr. DePreet, who will be joining us via Skype from Columbia University in just a few minutes, a hard copy of Dr. DePreet's presentation, hard copy of an article on workplace basic skills that Richard Froschel, labor market consultant and former director of the Labor Market and Career Information Department of the Texas Workforce Commission, sent to coordinating board staff to follow up on his presentation last month on the Texas Detailed Work Activities Common Language Project. A document that provides the results of the Survey on Higher Education Strategic Plan Targets that we as members of the Strategic Planning Committee completed since our last meeting, a document entitled Goals with Possible Targets, Indicators, and Strategies for the Next Higher Education Plan, a reformatted document with an alternative way of displaying the possible targets in the next long-range higher education plan. In terms of our agenda today, after the approval of the minutes from our January 14th meeting via Skype, we'll hear from Dr. Tom DePreet on gender differences in educational performance and educational attainment. Dr. DePreet is the Giddings Professor of Sociology and co-director of the Center for the Study of Wealth and Inequality at Columbia University. After our discussions with Dr. DePreet, we'll begin our discussions of possible targets for achieving the 4 goals we have proposed. Then we'll take a short break just before noon to retrieve our lunches before coming back together as a committee to continue our discussions. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes from our January 14th meeting. Moved and seconded. Any opposed? Motion passes. Finally, before I introduce Dr. DePreet, I wanted to remind you that our meeting is being webcast and that the webcast of our meetings are archived and available for viewing through the coordinating board's website. I also want to encourage committee members to ask questions and offer suggestions during our discussions. So with that, unless members have any questions, I'd like to begin our discussions today by introducing Dr. DePreet. Dr. DePreet's more detailed biography is in your packets of materials I mentioned earlier, but for those who are joining us via the web, Dr. DePreet is the Giddings Professor of Sociology, co-director of the Center for the Study of Wealth and Inequality at Columbia University, and a faculty member of the Columbia Population Research Center. Besides being on the faculty at Columbia, Dr. DePreet has been a member of the faculty at the University of Chicago, Duke University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Specialist in comparative research, Dr. DePreet also has held research appointments in Berlin and in Amsterdam. He is the author of numerous publications. His recent and ongoing projects include the study of gender differences in educational performance, educational attainment, fields of study, and the determinants of college persistence and dropout in the U.S. From Columbia, Dr. DePreet holds a Ph.D. in sociology and 2 master's degrees, one in sociology and the other in mathematical statistics. Also holds a bachelor's degree in humanities and sciences from MIT. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. DePreet. Dr. DePreet, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me fine?
We can.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I'm gonna go over some material that much of which is in my recent book with my good colleague Claudia Bookman, who's a professor of sociology at Ohio State University. It's a study that we were doing for some years that led to a book publication by the Russell Sage Foundation Press called The Rise of Women, the Growing Gender Gap in Education, and What It Means for American Schools. So I'll say some things that come out of that and from some related papers. Now we just have to. So I'm gonna ask for slides to be advanced, and I think this will work fine. So so please go to the next slide. I've organized this set of remarks into sort of four different components: an overview, some discussion about gender differences in performance, and then some things about attitudes and behavior, and then the last section will be on the importance of the local environment in determining the nature and extent of gender differences in educational outcomes. Okay, so the next slide, please. So we'll start with an overview of trends over the past sort of few decades. The next slide, please. Okay, and so what this slide is showing is it's showing sort of a remarkable reversal that's taken place in rates of college completion in the United States for the white population of the U.S. The slide is also showing the gender differences in black attainment as well, and there's an interesting difference between these two trends. If we focus on the white trend first, so just to get oriented, you can see there's a legend on this slide that solid line is white males, and then there's a dotted line white females, and then there's some short and long dots for black males and black females. And if you look at those top two slides, we see that there was in the x-axis is the year of birth, and the y-axis is the proportion completing a bachelor's degree or higher. And if you notice that for much of the 20th century, white males held a pretty sizable lead over white females in terms of their rates of college completion. Of course, rates of college completion have risen dramatically in the United States over the 20th century into the 21st century. You know, the early part of the 20th century was a period of time in which larger numbers of Americans were actually striving to achieve a secondary school education, but that when we reached a point in our history where the great bulk of students were achieving secondary education, sort of the next goal was higher education, and those rates were going up steadily. And as you can see, there was a large lead for males that gradually began diminishing. There's a period of time in the 80s, which is the birth cohorts of around the early 1960s, when white females caught white males in terms of the rates of college completion. And that gap has continued to widen. That rate of widening may have slowed in the most recent period of time, but there's now a pretty large gap. The black trends show the same kind of picture, with the exception of the fact that black females were always ahead of black males in terms of their rates of college completion. The main reason for this had to do with the structure of discrimination and segregation in the United States for a long time, because if you go back to the early part of the 20th century, we had simultaneously gender segregation and racial segregation. So the main jobs that one needed a college degree for were either being a high professional or a teacher or a nurse or a doctor or a lawyer or working as a manager or an engineer. Manager and engineer jobs were pretty much male-dominated, and they were pretty much out of reach for blacks because for much of the first half of the 20th century, corporations weren't hiring blacks. And so the discrimination largely affected the male population, whereas the black community still needed nurses and teachers. And so black women were getting those degrees. And as a consequence of this, the black female rate has been ahead of the black male rate throughout this period of time. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, but even though, as that previous slide showed, that the gap between women and men was growing for both the black and the white population, the sort of the differential benefit of civil rights for black males is sort of shown in this slide, where you see that if you go back to 1940, the odds ratios of white males having a college degree over black males was like 5 to 1. It was much higher than it was for the ratio of white females to black females, and that was for the reasons I just told you, having to do with the fact that there were many black women in nursing and teaching kinds of professions that required college degrees. And there's been a convergence between the in the odds ratios for the two genders, so that now for both women and men, the white odds are about twice as high as the black odds. So there's still a large racial gap in college completion in the U.S. Okay, next slide, please. And figure 3 is now showing the same thing with respect to the Hispanic population. That is, it's showing a trend line. The rates of college completion for Hispanics are lower than they are for whites. Again, the numbers for whites at the right hand of this line in figure 1 was like 0.3, a little over 0.3 for the males and a bit over 0.4 for the white females. These numbers are lower, but the general trend is the same, i.e. that there is a growing female advantage in the Hispanic population. Next slide, please. And this slide shows the same thing for Asians. It shows the fact that is sort of well known to social scientists, may be astonishing for the general population, of how high is the college completion rate for Asians and Asian Americans, much higher than it is for whites. But the general trend lines show the same qualitative pattern that we saw in the previous slides. That is, except for the black population, which had faced a unique history in the United States. You see this general pattern that the male rates were higher than the female rates, and then there was a period of convergence, and then an overtaking, and we're now in that world of overtaking. Oh, and I don't mind, by the way, if anyone has questions and wants to interrupt me. I'm happy to take questions as I talk or at the end. So if something isn't clear, just please let me know, okay? The data sources for these slides are at the bottom. They're the census, the U.S. Census, the so-called IPUMS, which is a microdata available, and also the American Community Survey for the recent years. Okay, next slide, please. The growing the educational attainment of women is evident not just in bachelor's degrees. It's also evident in master's degrees, PhDs, and professional degrees. So this axis is showing this growth. The right side of this axis is showing the percentage of the degrees obtained by women. You see that going back to 1970, only roughly 10% of PhDs and something on the order of 7% of professional degrees were awarded to women, and now those numbers are roughly 50%. Women always got a greater share of master's degrees than they did of professional and PhD degrees. And their share has continued to grow, and they now have a clear majority of these degrees as well. This data comes from the National Center for Education Statistics. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a bit complicated, and so I'm going to walk you through. So there's really two important characteristics of our current educational situation with respect to gender, if we focus at the college level. One is what I just showed you, which is that women are obtaining a greater share of the degrees than are men, but they're not in the same fields. And this graph here is showing the gender gap in BAs by field of study for the STEM degrees. That top black line is an odds ratio. It's showing basically the odds that college degree is obtained by a woman as opposed to a man. And you show that it shows there that 1981 was the year that women received the same number of BA degrees as men. That's where the odds were the same for the women and the men. And then the right side, it just continues to climb. But if we look at the lines below that, we see there's a line for the biological and biomedical sciences. There's one for mathematics and statistics. There's one for physical sciences and science technologies, and one for engineering and engineering technologies. In the early period, all of these lines are below that 1.0, which would signal gender equality. So this is the odds of a woman BA being, for example, in physical sciences and technology relative to something else, compared with a male. And all of these numbers are below 1 and often well below 1, which indicates sort of male dominance, that indicates that these degrees are being disproportionately awarded to males. Now, there's also trend lines there, okay? And there's a very clear, strong trend with respect to biological and biomedical sciences, as a greater and greater share of those majors have been women, and in fact, sometime in the late 1990s, we see that women surpassed men in the obtaining of those degrees. There are trends for engineering and physical sciences, but they have not brought women and men close to a state of convergence. Okay, so we still have clear differences, so to speak, in the distribution of degrees, even as we have female dominance in the overall rate of obtaining degrees. And if you look at that 1981 dot, it shows that in 1981, women received the same number of BA degrees as men, but only 1 in 9 engineering degrees. And if we look in 2009, where women are receiving nearly 60% of all BA degrees, they're only receiving 1 in 6 engineering degrees. So let's just put it this way. If women behaved the same way as men with respect to STEM degrees, we would have a huge increase in the proportion of engineers being graduated out of our universities. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, I can.
Thank you. Or a comment. We can't cure choice, right? I mean, there's no what. How do we cure choice?
Well, we're not. I don't know that. I don't know that we should have a policy of trying to cure choice. So we're trying to just. I'm trying to show you what the reality is. Over the course of this talk, I'll have something to say about the factors that lead to these different choices. So choices come from individuals. They also come from environments. I don't think it's our goal to take choice away from people. But we'll have more. I mean, I think this is something we can come back to in the discussion.
I assume that you're going to have, I hope you will, some discussion on the mathematics and statistics. That one is the one that really surprises me.
Well, that's coming. Next slide, please. Okay, and this picture here is this is showing the level of segregation in fields of study, and it's also showing trends. Okay, and I think that there's something, and it's showing it using 2 different measures. I don't think we need to focus on all the technical aspects, but if you look at that left slide, that uses something called the index of dissimilarity. It's a little bit easier to interpret it. The y-axis shows the proportion of one group that would have to change majors in order to have an equal distribution for men and for women. There's that dark line is the total. That's segregation across all the majors. and this goes back to the issue of sort of choice, which is interesting. It's not the case that women and men choose different majors. The majors that they choose has varied historically. Okay, so what you see there is you see that there was a period of time where there was considerable integration of majors, and that period of integration sort of went on and then began slowing down, and sometime around, I will say, 1995 or so, you see things sort of flatten out, with the other measure, the other measures measuring things differently, and the flattening out is earlier. Okay, but if you look over this period of time, you see that there were some decades where there was considerable convergence taking place, and then there was a period of flattening out. That left graph also breaks things down into different sets of majors. And I just want to call your attention to the dotted line, which is the one that has that dramatic drop, and that's looking at the collection of education and business majors, and you see there was rapid decline in dissimilarity that was basically women moving into business degrees, and that then sort of flattened out as well. Okay, so that the general pattern is one where there was sort of rapid change, and then since then there's been, I'll call it slow change. Okay, not no change. That is, there is still a gradual increase in the proportion of engineers and physical scientists that are women, but it's been fairly flat. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about academic performance, and you'll see that some of the antecedents of this gender difference in degrees, it has its antecedents in high school, middle school, and even in elementary school, and one needs to have some understanding of that in order to understand what's going on at the college level. So let's look at the next slide. So what this is looking at the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Test that was given to a set of young people in a survey done by the longitudinal survey done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And when they were adolescents, they were tested, and this is looking at the gender difference in the distribution of these test scores. You see that women are a little bit more likely than the men to be at I should say girls and boys at this point, okay, because they're adolescents. That the girls are a little more likely than the boys to be at the top of this distribution. I won't call these huge differences, okay, but there are some differences. But I want to look at the next slide because that's the one that. Okay, so this slide here is looking at the proportion of the kids, the adolescents, in each of these deciles of this aptitude test who graduated from college, four-year college. And what you see here is that every single one of these deciles, the girls have a lead over the boys. Okay, or in other words, to put it another way, the gender gap in degrees is not coming from. It's not largely coming from any gender advantage in how well the girls tested relative to the boys in adolescence. Okay, that they have an advantage in every one of these, and the advantage is actually really pretty large at that Q4, and it's relevant here because you have to remember that roughly a third of the population graduates from college with a four-year degree. So the college graduates are, for the most part, in that top 20 percentile and then in the next couple of bars. And there's a pretty large gender gap there. Now, if we go to the next slide. Okay, the next slide begins to make sense of where this gender gap's coming from. If it's not coming from test scores, where is it coming from? It's largely coming from grades. Okay, this picture here is showing self-reported grades in 8th grade. Again, in the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth 1997 cohort. And you see that there is a really substantial advantage that 8th grade girls have over 8th grade boys in the United States in terms of their performance in school. This, by the way, isn't new. I mean, as far as we can tell, going back in time with the data that we have, that girls have tended to outperform boys in terms of their grades for as much time as we can see. Okay, but if we go to the next slide, the next slide pretty much makes sense of the gender gap in college completion, because when you look here, so this shows the proportion of complete college by their grades in 8th grade. Okay, so not surprisingly, much higher proportion of the kids who were getting A's get college degrees. It's in the order of 70%. And then it drops down to about 40% for kids that are getting A's and B's. When we get to kids getting B's, the proportion is down to around a third. And in the overall country, it's like 33% getting college degrees. And then kids that are getting B's and C's and lower have much lower proportions who are completing college, many years later. But the interesting thing about this graph is that there's not a gender gap. In other words, you pretty much have explained away the gender gap in college completion by looking at the grades these kids are getting in 8th grade. It's not that 8th grade is destiny at the individual level, but in terms of the population, you can pretty much make sense of what's going on by 8th grade. If you look at the next slide. So the next slide is showing grades by gender in high school. And not too surprisingly, it's the same kind of picture we just saw, that kids getting A's and B's, that girls dominate that. And I will just sort of say as a biographical footnote that what started me and Claudia on this project at the beginning was when my youngest daughter was in 6th grade, and the 6th grade Durham school system, the Durham school system decided to have an ice cream social for all the 6th graders that had perfect report cards. And they invited all the parents to show up on a warm May day at a park. They trucked in all this ice cream, bussed all the kids in. It was like the last day of school, and they gave them ice cream, and then they lined them up, and the superintendent gave them all certificates. And I was stunned by the fact that something on the order of 70% of the kids in these lines were girls. And that sort of led to this study, actually. Okay, if we look at the next slide, figure 13. Okay, this is showing the same thing that I showed for the 8th grade slide, which is that there's no gender gap in the proportion of kids by grade who are getting college degrees to speak of. In fact, the boys have a bit of an advantage amongst those getting A's. Or to put it another way, that understanding what their grades are in high school, pretty much explains the gender gap in college degrees. Next slide, please. But what I've already said that, if we look back in time, we find that that girls generally get higher grades than boys in school, but something important has changed, and this pretty much changed in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, and that has to do with the courses they were taking. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because of changes in opportunity for women in the labor force and changes in conceptions of gender roles and the like, a larger and larger fraction of girls began thinking about college as something that they wanted to do, and so they began to take the courses that one needs to take to get into college, and in particular those of them that were thinking about getting into selective colleges were focusing on the courses they needed to take to get into those selective colleges. And those things motivated the girls to increasingly take courses in science and in mathematics. And if you look at these gateway courses to college, Algebra 2 chemistry, Algebra 2 Algebra 2 and chemistry, and then the last plot shows the combination of them. You see that, girls now take a greater fraction. I mean, girls are more likely to take these courses than are boys. Okay? They may not be more likely to major in STEM fields, but they are more likely to take these science courses in high school. Next slide, please. And this here, this is another way of sort of showing where the gender gap in college degrees comes from. So if you go back in history through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, earlier than 1980, there was always boys always had, let's put it this way, a lead in terms of the proportion who were going to post-secondary education. They may not have been performing better in high school, but they were more likely to go on to post-secondary education. And of course, you can't complete a college degree if you don't start college. This gender gap in the probability of starting college gradually diminished. And in the there's something called the Nels cohort. There's a study that the education department, it does these studies every year. Every 10 years. In 1987-88, they began following a cohort of 8th graders. And so these 8th graders in 1987-88 were followed, through their mid-20s. And this cohort is interesting because this is the cohort where the male advantage and the proportion of students going to college had disappeared. And for this cohort, there was a 5 percentage point gap in college completion rates in favor of the girls, which has grown since then, as I showed in the first slide. And so this is showing where that comes from. And it breaks out the students in terms of whether they had any 2-year college or only 4-year college. That first line is showing that, that 50% of the high school grads had any 2-year college. There was a slight advantage for the females because some 2-year college students then transferred to 4-year college. That was contributing a small amount to the gender gap. But as it turned out, for that cohort, the boys were a bit more likely to then go to 4-year college, conditional on some 2-year college. And so at that point, we've not explained very much of the gap at all. But then that third line looks at a probability of getting a BA, given that the students have gone to both 4-year and 2-year college. And you see there's an 8 percentage point gain, lead advantage for the girls, for the females, for the women. That next column, it does a statistical adjustment, and it looks at the predicted proportion of those men who would have graduated if they had the same grades as the women. And you see that grade adjustment explains all that gap. And so up till now, we've now explained half of the total gap. Then we look at the next line, which is the proportion that had only 4-year college, which is 29%. Same for both males and females. But then we look at the proportion getting a BA, given only 4-year college. And again, there is a considerable gender gap, and that is entirely due to the fact that the girls are getting higher grades than the boys in college. So, to a large extent, that gender gap in college completion, that 5 percentage point gap, and the Nels cohort was being driven by the higher performance of the college women than the college men, and that can be traced back to high school and to middle school. Okay, next slide. Okay, a little bit on attitudes and behavior. I guess we have to move a little faster because time. So if we go to the next slide. This is data from the early child longitudinal study, the kindergarten cohort of 1998. These are the kindergartners who moved through to 8th grade in the first decade of the 21st century. The teachers were asked to sort of rate the students on a variety of behavioral scales. How strong was their attachment in school and their attention and things like this. Boys get considerably higher scores than do girls, and in fact the gender gap is even larger than the gap in the ratings of kids who are below and above the poverty line in these schools. So there's a considerable gender difference. Okay, next slide. This is looking at the 8th graders in the ECLSK who were being asked about how important grades are to them. And I've broken them out here by whether the students were getting mostly A's or other. And if you look at that first line, you're looking at the fraction of boys and girls who are saying that grades are very important. You see there's a considerable advantage for the girls. Girls are more likely than boys to say that grades are very important. They're more likely to say that if they're getting mostly A's. They're also more likely to say that if they're not getting mostly A's. Not surprisingly, the kids that are performing better are more likely to say the grades are very important to them. And we already know from the earlier slide that the girls have a considerable advantage relative to the boys in the proportion getting A's. So there's a stronger attachment of the girls than the boys in middle school to academics. Next slide. This is looking at the proportions who say they fit in and are enjoying school, and we see small but consistent advantages for the girls. They're more likely to say they fit in. They're more likely to say that they're always or often close to their teachers. Okay, next slide, please. So I think one of the issues has to do with this attachment to school. Another issue has to do with a lack of awareness of the labor market, and I think this is also an important part of the whole story. So the PISA in 2006, it's an international study, including the United States, of sort of academic performance for 15-year-olds, and it asks the kids, what occupation that they, want to be in, plan to be in. And, an astonishing 73% of the U.S. 15-year-old girls said they expected to work in managerial, professional, or higher technical jobs, which we think of as the labor force of today and tomorrow. They had a large lead over the boys. On the other hand, the boys were more likely than the girls, like by 9% to 2%, to expect to be things which are not necessarily realistic. Let's put it that way. Professional athletes, work in other sports jobs, or be musicians. I didn't put the numbers up here, but there were too many boys who were expecting to be military officers, or policemen or firemen. There simply weren't enough policemen or firemen or military officers in the country for all of these boys with those aspirations to have those jobs. And then boys are more likely to respond vaguely or not at all to the question of the job they expected to have at age 30. And then there was a Gallup poll. Well, this is about 10 years ago, but it's still somewhat astonishing. It was asking people, including young people, about what they thought their chances were in the future of being rich, whatever rich meant to them. And boys are consistently, and men are consistently more optimistic than women about the chances that they would someday be rich. And an astonishing 58% of the 18 to 29-year-old young men thought that they were more, somewhat or very likely that they'd be rich, in a country where at this age we know that, only maybe half of them had college degrees. And the women were less optimistic, even though they had the chances of marrying a guy who men make more money than women. So their chances of getting rich through marriage are a bit greater. So there is a kind of a sort of a disconnect, so to speak, between the way that these young men see the world and the way the world actually is. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think that, two big parts to the explanation. One part of it is that the females have an advantage in training for the educational marathon that comes from their greater short-term gratification from attachment to school and good performance in school. I mean, I think it's fair to say that most all boys know that if you want to be on the varsity basketball team, you can't like blow off basketball until you're a junior in high school, and then say, "Now I'm going to get serious about basketball and make the team." And you can't do that for football. You can't do it for baseball. There's less awareness of the fact that you can't like wait until you're a junior or senior in high school and then get serious about academics and expect to get through college. Now, it may be the case that the girls are better than the boys at being forward-looking about this. But the fact that they seem to get more short-term gratification from their academics in elementary school and in middle school, means that in effect they're training for the education marathon, even if they don't realize that's what they're doing. And I think that is one of the reasons why that they end up getting higher educational attainment. And then the second, I think, is that the labor market has changed, and this change is providing a greater cultural challenge to boys than girls, particularly if they don't come from middle class or higher households. I mean, that we have these multiple conceptions of masculinity in our society. There is this sort of traditional sense of the strong man. Go back to Carousel, the musical, and the song "My Boy Bill," which tells the story of I want my boy to be strong, and it has a kind of a fantasy character to it, and that that I'll call it old conception of masculinity was sort of adequate for like much of human history, so to speak, for a man to grow up, get a wife, and provide for them. But we've sort of moved into a new world with a labor market that in some sense creates a much more powerful man if he becomes a corporate lawyer than if he can lift weights and play basketball well. And I think that the sons of corporate lawyers may come to realize that focusing on school, getting into college, going to law school, being like my dad, I'm more like, I'll make a lot of money, I'll find myself a good wife, I'll have a nice lifestyle. Whereas that alternative sort of modern conception of masculinity, I think, is a little more difficult for the sons of middle class, lower middle class, working class parents to to focus on in middle school. Okay, next slide. And next slide. So just a couple things on the environment. Boys are more sensitive than girls to the absence of a father in the household, and of course, we have a lot of unstable families in the United States right now. Boys are more sensitive than girls to the presence of a high-status, highly educated father. That's what I just told you in words. You also can see it in the statistics. And I've just said why I think that is, that it has to do with the competing pull of these multiple, somewhat conflicting models of masculinity in our society. Nobody ever thought that the 8th grade, nerd was a super masculine guy, even if that person ends up, when he's 45, being an engineer and making $300,000, $400,000 a year. At which point, that would be pretty good if you could get that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the environment matters. This is one of the things I was saying before in response to that question. That it turns out, so we've done studies both in Europe. This is actually looking at a picture of schools in Berlin, but the same picture would be there if we looked at schools in Chicago. We've done a study in Chicago now as well. There tends to be a gender gap in performance in school, and you see it in elementary school, you see it in middle school. However, the size of that gender gap is sensitive to the local environment. That in general, schools that have stronger academic climates tend to be schools where that gender gap shrinks. In other words, boys are more sensitive to the environment, and boys benefit more from a strong academic environment. It creates sort of status rewards for being a good student. When the class is not academically strong, an oppositional culture develops, an alternative status system tempts at least some fraction of the boys. And as I would say, they tend to be the boys whose fathers are not providing an alternative role model to them, and the academic achievement gap grows. So the environment is important. Next slide, please. The same thing is true about orientation towards STEM, and this was the point that I was making before. That so we have a kind of there are these stereotypes that we have in our society that that people adopt or fight against. Okay, so there this oppositional masculinity in middle school. There's a stereotype around there. There's a stereotype around the idea that boys are better in math than are girls. So we did a study of a set of high schools for which we had lots of kids in the National Education Longitudinal Study, and found that the gap in the in an orientation toward STEM, in other words, the proportion of high school seniors who say that they want to go to college and major in STEM fields in college. If you look at the proportion of males who say that and the proportion of females who say that, then you can measure the gender gap. The size of that gender gap varies across high schools. And it varies across high schools even when you take into account the kids' orientation towards science in 8th grade and their math grades in 8th grade and all kinds of sort of pre-high school variables. And the next slide, please. And we find that gender gap tends to shrink in schools that have stronger science curriculums. And our interpretation of that is because in schools with strong science curriculums, girls are exposed to science. Girls are exposed to the fact that they do very well in science. And those experiences tend to fight against stereotypes that science isn't for girls. It doesn't convince all girls to be scientists, of course, nor does it convince all boys to be scientists. But generally speaking, the gender gap in STEM fields shrinks in schools with strong science curriculums. Next slide, please. And interestingly, the gender gap also shrinks in schools that have relatively integrated extracurricular activities. In our interpretation of this, obviously there are some extracurricular activities that almost by their nature are gender segregated, like the football team doesn't have girls on it. But there's lots and lots of other sort of clubs and things that schools have. And it turns out that schools in which the girls and the boys tend to segregate into different activities are the same schools where you tend to see a large gap in the proportion of the high school seniors who say they want to do STEM. And we think that's because those schools they create a high salience for a gender stereotype that then gets applied to science and math, and that leads to more girls saying that that's not for me. Next slide, please. I think we're almost finished. Okay, I just said this, so let's go to the next slide because I think we're... Okay, and I think this final point, I'm just sort of making it in words, that gender differences in career orientation are very important, I think, for understanding the gender gap in STEM fields. So we just did a recent study on 2 elite Israeli universities, and these Israeli universities are very interesting for us because in Israel, students don't apply to the college. They don't apply to like Rice or UTexas. They apply to specific majors. You apply to like chemical engineering at Rice. And you're accepted or rejected for that major, and so they apply to like more than one. We had the administrative data from these 2 universities. One's the Technion, which is like the MIT of Israel, and the other is Tel Aviv University, which is the other elite university in Israel. And what was quite interesting, and I would suggest this applies to the United States as well, is that the male students are more responsive to the labor market returns of potential majors than were women. So because of this administrative data, we're able to find out, what the salaries were of recent graduates from these elite universities in all of these different science majors. And what you found was that the men, much more than the women, were oriented toward the majors that paid the best in the labor market. And that attempted crowding into those majors made those majors the most competitive. That is the hardest to get into. So much more than the women, males were focused in their first choice on these most lucrative majors, which for many of them were a reach, given how hard they were to get into. Now, these were all good students, but they would reach in their first choice toward the most lucrative major on the labor market, and then they would use for their second choice a safer, less competitive science or engineering major. And and this raises the question of whether the gender gap in STEM orientations, is really a gender difference in orientation towards science, or whether it's a gender difference in an orientation to a labor market, where the males are paying more attention to how much does the field pay than are the females. I mean, you see the same kind of thing in medicine, where the orthopedics and cardiovascular surgery, the most highly paid medical specialties, tend to be dominated by males. And I've always thought it'd be funny to have a thought experiment where everybody in medical school woke up tomorrow and discovered that pediatrics paid the best, way more than orthopedic surgery. And I think it would take 5 years before you would discover that all the males are trying to be, not all of them, but large numbers of them are trying to be pediatricians. But so I don't, I think it's not, we can't look at these differences and just say they're inherent, an inherent interest in chemistry or physics. We have to take into account that when the college students and the high school students are looking at these, they're also looking at the consequences of majoring in them, and I think that's an important point. And that's the end of my remarks. So.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. DePreet. I'd like to open it up to the committee for questions. Well, I'll start here. I mean, our charge as a strategic planning committee is to really focus on goals for the state of Texas that will replace closing the gaps. And we're largely evolving into still focusing on gaps, maybe a little narrower than the original plan, but with a goal of 60% of our workforce having some type of post-secondary attainment by a 2030 date, which is kind of a percentage and a time frame that is not unusual for either international or national standards. But obviously closing these gaps at a subcomponent, whether it's gender or ethnicity or income, becomes more important for us to be able to put together a plan that has any chance of success. We're currently at 34%, and we're focused on the 25 to 34-year-old population. So we're currently at 34%. If you bring in certificates, technical certificates, we get to about 38% today. So we've got a considerable gap, and the subcomponents, once again, whether it's gender or ethnicity, can you try to take what you said and try to, from a policy recommendation, and when you're at our level here, the 30,000-foot level, trying to lay out a plan to ultimately lead into strategies, what insights could you bring to us there?
Well, I mean, the shortfall between where we are and your goals, a large part of that has to do with the non-completion in post-secondary education. Mm-hmm. If you remember one of my earlier slides, we saw that the probability of getting a BA, given that someone started in 2-year college in transfers, is really pretty low. And even those who started in 4-year college, large numbers don't finish. So I think that, to achieve those goals, you have to improve the completion rates, the degree completion rates of kids that are starting post-secondary education. And, I think that that means sort of dealing with all these remedial courses that so many kids have to take when they get to post-secondary education, which don't count toward degrees, and which discourage them. But, again, I think that the reason for that need the origin of that problem is in the high schools than in the middle schools. And so I think that it's going to be unrealistic to think one can solve that problem without, paying careful attention to academic achievement in middle school and in high school. It's not a problem of aspirations. If you go back and you look at studies of middle schoolers and ask, what are their educational aspirations, they're incredibly high. Okay, and again, I think the sports analogy is very sound. That is, I think the 7th and 8th graders, if they want to be on the varsity baseball team, coach has told them that the way you do that is you practice, practice, practice. I don't think the message gets through as clearly on academics. You want to graduate from college, but I don't think they fully understand that means they have to, that to achieve the goals that they set for themselves, they need to invest a bit more in their education. And of course, the schools have to help them. I'm not just blaming the kids. I mean, they're just kids.
Okay. Any other questions for Dr. DePreet? I think the message that you're sending, at least that I'm understanding, is there's a significant environmental signaling, if you want to put it that way, that has to begin relatively early if we're going to have the elimination of these gaps, whether they be gender or otherwise constituted. Woody?
Yeah, that's my message.
Yeah. Okay. Bob?
I find this study fascinating because I have a personal interest in this. First of all, I'm a chemical engineer, and second of all, my family has established a Women in Engineering endowment for scholarships for women in engineering, and we're trying to take that, if you look at figure 6, that flatness out of that particular curve, and what I'm trying to ascertain out of your presentation is, what is it that we can do to trigger more women to take on engineering and those kinds of degrees, where if you look at figure 14, they are completing Algebra 2 and chemistry courses, which are considered hard. And if you look at then the one figure, I guess it's lack of awareness of the labor market. 73% of the 15-year-old girls expect to work in managerial, professional, and higher technical jobs. Higher technical jobs is where the new jobs are. And
right.
It just seems to me that somehow we've got to get that triggered. I guess I'm looking for ways to do that.
Right. Well, I mean, the story about my little daughter, Justine, so she went to Stanford and majored in computer science, and she's a software engineer. So she bucked those curves. I think it, partly it takes a supportive environment. It takes an environment in which, girls and young women feel that, that science, that majoring in science is an activity that where they feel supported. I mean, I think that's important. Another thing, this may be more of a minor issue, but I still think it's significant, which we found in studies, is that women college students, generally seem to be more interested in a broad education than men. And so, and now I'm speaking in really in practical terms, that one of the problems with engineering majors is they tend to be relatively intense, and they don't leave as much time for a general education. And that by itself could be something that that discourages women. I mean, you can, medical schools are now 50% women, law schools are 50% women. In both of those cases, the women can major in college in what they want and get their general education, and then they can go and be a doctor. And that's a harder thing to do in engineering. I'm not proposing a whole-scale revamping of the curriculum, but some awareness of that, might also be helpful.
Yes, Bernie.
Are we bucking a reality that gender differences can be okay?
Well, I'm not. I mean, I mean, gender differences are okay. I mean, women are, women and men are different, just like women are different from each other, and men are different from each other. One of the themes we emphasize in our book is that one has to be very careful and not see this as if all men are the same and all boys are the same and all girls are the same. There's tremendous diversity in both genders, and that diversity dominates. It dwarfs the sort of the mean difference between the genders. I do think that when you're in a world where there are sort of clear vocational routes for students of either gender that are not oriented toward high level academics, that you improve their lives as well as sort of I think the societies. And I'm just very respectful of the German educational system, where there are all of these well developed sort of vocational routes to various kinds of certificates, in which the numbers of people going into them are kept in balance with the number of jobs that are available for them when they finish. And I think that can be part of the solution as well.
I have a question, and that is, if you have parents, you have populations with large proportions of the parents who have not been to college, so that there's no parental guidance there, encouragement, or well, there may be encouragement, but not much guidance in terms of areas and so forth. How does a state, how does a large-scale organization replace that component? Are there any ideas of how to replace that component?
Well, of course, it's challenging because parents have a huge impact in kids' lives, right? And I mean, clearly, one of the advantages that the children of professional, highly educated parents is they have teachers in the house, who can make up for issues, issues in the schools. I mean, I have to say that one of my three daughters learned high school chemistry largely from me. I got the chemistry medal in high school, and you went to MIT, and we weren't satisfied with the teacher. And that's, of course, most parents can't do that. And it's challenging for a state to come up with the resources to make up for those kinds of, I'll call them human capital gaps in the household. It's a matter of finding, I think, cost-effective solutions. I mean, one thing that I'm a bit enamored of right now is tutoring. If one can find ways of setting up tutoring programs that can, that aren't very expensive. There was just an interesting report out of Chicago of a tutoring program that actually was producing pretty considerable results for not a lot of money. That may be a practical strategy. But you need to find some way of providing, these kids in middle school and high school a way to learn things they want to learn but aren't able to learn from the existing sort of school structure.
Woody? Are there differences in the gender gap, for example, in high schools where academics are emphasized? I mean, in some of the high schools, for example, that you have to apply to and get into, rather than the run-of-the-mill public schools?
Well, I mean, it's always challenging to study school effects in schools where there is sort of strong selection. We ask the question, what is the benefit of going to Columbia or Yale on the kids that we graduate, and we'd like to believe there is a strong benefit, but of course we've done such a tremendously rigorous job of selecting people that they're already very good students when they arrive here. I'm sorry. What we found in the Chicago schools, we're just looking at the elementary schools where it really isn't a selection into these schools. They're public schools. That the kids that were lucky enough to get into classrooms where there was a higher fraction of, I'll say, middle class kids, that those kids did better. and we're persuaded by that and other evidence that students in general, but especially boys, benefit from strong academic climates. Now, of course, there are strong academic climates in selective schools, but again, those selective schools have already selected academically oriented kids. And I don't think that those are the ones who are the issue here in terms of meeting the goals you're talking about.
Yes, Bernie.
In reference to tutors, in the flesh, aren't they like 20 cents on the dollar offshore now with the ability to Skype them? And then we have, let's see, there's Khan Academy that is outstanding. Is affordability of tutoring a real issue?
Well, I don't think we know as much as we need to know about tutoring programs. I mean, if the country got like really serious about this, and said we really are committed to raising educational attainment rates, and we're really committed to investing what we need to invest in the middle and high schools in order to make that possible, there's a lot of questions that we don't know the answers to. So, like, I suspect that that kids need some in-person tutoring, not just online tutoring. And I don't think that tutoring is simply a matter of like teaching them algebra, but it's also teaching them how to learn. I mean, I think that, it's a conceit perhaps. My wife and I, we think that one of the reasons our kids did so well was because we taught them how to learn. We didn't just teach them content. And I think that's often best done in face-to-face interaction.
Okay, for the committee, we're coming close to the end of our time with Dr. Dupreet. Any more questions from anybody? Yes, Bernie, one last question.
Just to clarify what you just said, specifically parental tutoring gets the job done. Is that kind of sort of what you were saying?
No, I wasn't saying that. I was saying that of course, sometimes it does. I mean, many parents are great tutors. What I was saying is that, educational deficits, sometimes involve like orientations to learning. They don't involve a failure to understand how to solve an equation with, two unknowns. They involve how does one learn how to solve that equation. And that process of learning how to learn, that process of believing in yourself, of not becoming too anxious when it's time to take a test, learning how to calm down, those kinds of things are often best learned, with someone you trust in face-to-face. I think that online tutoring is a very important supplement. I think that's very important too, but I'm thinking a combination strategy is the one that has the best chance of working.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Dupreet. We appreciate your time and the information you've shared with us this morning. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right, thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Now I'd like to begin our discussion possible targets by asking Deputy Commissioner David Gardner and Senior Director Ginger Grossman to provide some background information and lead us in a discussion of our survey results. During our discussions, please share your opinions. Consider what we need to happen in Texas for the future prosperity of our state and its people, and what we need to do to get us there. Please also consider if the target numbers are both challenging and realistic. Ask yourselves, can we achieve the overall goal we have proposed if these targets aren't achieved? And in a book, The Secret of the Slight Edge, How to Get Out of Your Own Way, has said most people don't aim too high and miss. They aim too low and hit, which might be a description of closing the gaps 2015. And with that, David and Ginger.
Okay. Let me begin with just one comment about the last presentation. I didn't want to prolong that, but I read about 2 months ago someone suggesting that one issue that women may have is, and he mentioned the great importance of grades to women. And this particular article was talking about women, the concern that some women weren't choosing certain courses or majors because they were concerned about not making an A. And I don't think that's been entered into this, but I can think of, I have one daughter that made a 790 quantitatively on the SAT and majors in chemistry. The other one made a 710 and thinks she's very bad at math and is a sociology major. She made 790 on the critical thinking part. But I think I've wondered at times if she's, the standard is higher at some level, and that making a B may be considered a failure in some ways, and to what extent that is, and that the standards are higher. When you're surrounded by people with a 790 and 800 SATs, and the quantitative part, as my daughter with a 710 was, relatively speaking, she isn't nearly as good as her friends, and maybe perhaps the male doesn't think of it that way. So I just think that's something that we probably have to get beyond as well. So, goals and targets. I just wanted to start out by reminding you that the really critical part of targets is that they provide the means to really adjust, track, and monitor progress on the goals as we go along. So as you discuss the targets today, bear in mind, do these targets provide information that might help us at intervals as we progress through the plan to identify areas that we may need, that may require more attention. And that's the primary reason for the targets, in my view, and that's how we use them with closing the gaps in terms of, we often said that in terms of achieving the participation target, we could achieve the overall number, but if we didn't hit where we needed to in terms of Hispanics, we hadn't fully succeeded. And so that's part of what we're looking for in terms of the targets. Which targets may help us identify that perhaps, in this case, we're not even keeping pace with where males are currently in terms of participating in higher ed and graduating. Perhaps we're finding that with the wrong, without a target, that we're actually increasing the number of students with debt, even though we're holding the percent of debt at a certain level. We don't want to achieve our goal simply by having more students on debt. But so those are the things that bear in mind as we go forward. I'd like to thank all of you. As of late yesterday afternoon, everyone responded to the survey. We appreciate that. I think it showed some important things. We thought it was important to have a category for maybe, and I can tell you that was really important because many of you use that category. And I think that we will particularly focus on those targets today in which there were large numbers of maybes. We will go as slowly or as fast as this requires. These are important for the discussion today. We're disappointed we weren't able to have the governor's office today. We will have them in March, but it provides us a better opportunity for a heavy focus on the targets today, which is important and warranted at this time. So with that, I think we can proceed to Ginger, and you guys will control the pace today.
And David and I did have a discussion between now and our last meeting around our targets, and really my sense was that the committee really needed to understand the assumptions behind some of the numbers that were presented to us as targets to achieve our overall goal, and in a sense of decomposing to understand from an historical standpoint what's been our productivity rate, how have we been increasing, but also the impact of the demographic projections. And some of these goals, for example, in Hispanic completions, are much more dramatic than they are. Well, how much of that are we using the same assumption there in terms of improving completion rates within Hispanics? and or is it all driven by population growth that's much greater in that group? So for as a committee, I think we need to have a fundamentally good understanding of all of the assumptions so that we can have confidence and buy into the conclusions. Other questions on things like our participation rates that were showing very modest increases, and are they really consistent with the type of completions? Because at least the implication was that our completion rate of those that go on and participate was going to be much higher than it's been historically. If we're pushing up completion here and we're only nudging up participation, we need to be able to connect those dots. At least in my mind, the committee needs to feel comfortable with
That's right.
And how the staff got to those conclusions.
That would be
if I could interfere, one thing too, I think it'd be very helpful for most of us to know the current value for these and the progress made in the last 10 years in that particular dimension, so that if you're looking for, let's say, 35% for something, you're just throwing something in the air, it'd be good to know whether our most recent measurement of that was 30 or 25 or 20, and it would be useful to know whether we'd gone from 10 to 20 or 10 to 30, or what progress been made in the past, so we had some understanding of how far we're reaching or not, or how modestly we're reaching when we set a given goal.
That's the intent for today, and in fact, I understand that it was a state holiday yesterday, but Ginger and Julie were in here yesterday doing some last-minute filling in on those gaps. I think we need to consider this a working meeting, so there may be some things where we've felt we've answered them, but we haven't, and we can, in some cases, get back to you during the course of the meeting. I can tell you that in looking at some of what they prepared briefly this morning, it actually suggested to me that in one area where I had been wondering if we were too aggressive, I'm wondering now if we're not aggressive enough after seeing how the numbers were calculated. So I think this can be a very revealing day today, and we'll probably have to continue it into the next meeting if we get into a lot of detail on all of them, and we'll take as much time as is necessary for you to understand this is important.
I think that's really important because we need to know what the trend lines look like, because some things we may be saturated. You're up against a wall, and you have to understand that part of it. Others, as you indicated, we may be undershooting. And so I think having some trend line doesn't mean that you're going to just extrapolate it out, but it does mean that it gives you some sense of what has happened and some reasons why it has happened.
And in some cases, I mean, the one that I was looking at today, the extrapolation, I think, is fairly clear, but I think, at least to me, it suggests we wouldn't be making an improvement if we continue that trend, even though the number looks very large and immense. Oh, let me mention briefly, so you'll know, you have here on the web audience has the information you're looking at out at the College Town Hall, Texas.com, and they'll be able to look at much of the same data that you will as we're discussing it.
Right, and I didn't neglected to mention that Susan Brown, our Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Planning, will be participating. Julie Eklund, the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding. Ginger, I mentioned, but I didn't neglected to mention that she'd recently been promoted from the Coordinating Board's Director of Planning to the Coordinating Board Senior Director for Innovation and Policy Development. Congratulations. And Paul Turcott, who's the Program Director for Strategic Planning and Funding, will also be participating.
Lori's.
Yes, Lori.
Yes, I have a concern, I guess, from the last presentation and now looking at this kind of with fresh eyes again, that in educational attainment in this particular overarching goal, we don't disaggregate poor students and are economically disadvantaged, and yet in the other goal of completion we do. And it strikes me that just thinking generally, if we look at any school system in any urban area across the state, they're probably at least 80% disadvantaged, if not more. Houston, Dallas, or even more. And I'm wondering if that's more of the tail wagging the dog than gender. And I'm wondering if maybe that should be a target as well, or maybe if you could respond to that. It just seems to me that if we were to have the greatest impact, it wouldn't necessarily be on gender or race, it would be on economically disadvantaged students.
One of the debates the staff has been having is whether certain targets need to be repeated under more than one goal. And because they're included, maybe only included under one goal doesn't mean they're not relevant to another. But that's something we can discuss today, and I think that will come up during the conversation. The completion is the one area that higher education actually can come close to controlling. The educational attainment overall is something the whole state has to contribute to, and including higher education. So one could argue what to do, but that's something you have to consider today. It just, because it's not included in one doesn't mean it's not important. And this is what, actually I've just been handed one where what you're going to see today.
That's the new way I looked at the targets.
Strategies. Yeah, okay. Have they received this?
Yes.
They did, right? Yeah. Okay, I thought you were handing it to me because it included what Lori was asking about, but it doesn't. So we're going to systematically walk through these, and I think that's probably the easiest way to bring it up. And if we don't have a target that we're considering already, please bring it up in the area. And, the educational attainment is overall, I think, is the biggest challenge. And actually, when Woody and I spoke, I guess our next to last phone call with the issue, we haven't directly addressed much the high school, the public school component of this in the way we did before, and that perhaps comes up through a strategy. But I think we heard today again that that's going to have a direct impact on how successful we are.
The question that I posed to David was, and it's kind of a political dividing line out there between the coordinating board and the TEA, but for us to have a realistic plan that shows, a significant improvement in post-secondary completions, I don't see how we cannot be prescriptive as far as our K through 12 outcomes as far as college-ready, post-secondary ready students. And I think that was reinforced with Dr. DePrete today, that it's really a middle school or maybe even earlier issue. And if we're not willing to set goals there, and I don't know at what level of detail, but it seems to me that that's something that we certainly as a committee need to consider if we're going to be serious about a significant improvement in the pipeline.
With Closing the Gaps, we had a heavy focus on the pre-college, and it wasn't addressed directly in the goals, but it was heavily represented in our strategies and in our targets to a slightly lesser extent. Through that process, we had P-16 councils established all over the state. Laurie was very involved in that. In Houston, we had Go Centers created. We, the recommended high school program became the default curriculum in the state. We have a new HB5 curriculum, and part of what we have to be doing now is to make sure that through that curriculum, we continue our progress. As I mentioned to Woody, we don't know as much about that program because it hasn't been in place, but we need to make sure that we take an active role somehow to make sure that we don't lose ground, that we actually gain ground with the new curriculum in some way. I thought, actually, as I listened to the professor from Columbia, where he was talking about women making more choices to take certain college-ready courses, what will be happening within the HB5, if there might be differences in terms of gender or ethnic selections in terms of those programs, which we haven't had in more recent years. And these are all things we probably need to attend to in some way.
Larry?
Yeah, I'm in some ways just reiterating what Woody just said, but I'd like to reinforce that the Dupreet talk. Actually, he had one slide I thought that was really powerful, which is clearly indicated that 100% of the gender gap at the higher education is rooted in high school grades, in grade differential. 100%. Another way of saying that is that there's nothing that we can do in higher education that is in the purview of the Higher Education Coordinating Board to close the gender gap, except to preach at the other side of education. That does draw this, this challenge that Woody was talking about, the fact that we're going to end up having to write a report that does have implications for other parts of education. But I don't know any issue that I've seen presented to us that was so clearly along that dividing line, or drawn along that dividing line, where essentially all of the solution is on the other side of the dividing line. That's a pretty remarkable graph that he had there.
Well, and I think it's important to remember, if I could, that the schools of ed are very important, yet they continue to remain somewhat the stepchild at almost every institution where they reside, and they're in terms of how important they are to the success of the very school that houses them. And somehow that has to change. We are finding some success with Advise Texas near peer advisors that are going out to our lowest performing schools, and we're trying to get some help with that through the legislature. But there are a number of things we can do. I think we preaching can help. I think we've done some preaching over the last years. He mentioned that there are high aspirations. When Closing the Gaps was first adopted, there was a belief that many parents in certain families didn't believe higher education was important, but when we had analysis conducted, we found that it was just the opposite, that they believed it was important, but they didn't believe they could afford it, so the shift of the campaign changed. I was also struck by what he said about sports. 20 years ago, Jesse Jackson used to talk to young men and talk about if they spent the time, with their studies that they spent with athletics, that they would be more successful. And he was somewhat making that point. There's a professor at Stanford in psychology who's been talking a lot to younger people about the fact that you can actually build your mind in the sense of practice, repetition, and somehow I'm wondering if there's a message there somehow that we can communicate in a much more effective way, because you're right, that was very striking, and it's all about, if you remember the popular book a few years ago, Talent is Overrated, in which they didn't say that talent wasn't worth anything, but you still had to practice, and you still had to practice smartly, which is part of even, not everybody even knows how to study. How do you study in a smart kind of way, spend your time in an effective way? And these are all things that people who are successful in school know, either because they figured it out on their own or somebody taught it to them. And so perhaps we need to find a way to make sure everybody is aware of that.
And I don't want to distract from the distinguished professor's performance, but I can tell you, at least experientially, that I've seen programs that, in fact, helped direct one at UTSA where we directed some very concerted attention on young women who thought they couldn't get through a demography program because it was too mathematically intensive, who did very well, and in fact are doing very well now and are doing better than their male counterparts. So I think you can do some of that closure at the higher education level.
Ramon?
Dr. Faulkner, when I looked at that, and I realized that in high school I had C's, I had about a 0.5% chance of finishing college. If I would have known that, I probably wouldn't have even tried. But
in those days, C's were better grades than they are.
Probably. Probably. Looking at the educational attainment and that 60% that's consistent for 2030, I don't know how that compares to other states and whether that's an overall great goal for the state of Texas. And then consistent with the discussion we had about should we always expect a gap, and if we are going to expect some gap, if we really got to 60% for blacks and Hispanics, what would really happen to the first item of the overall increase of Texans? And then what's missing here is the percent increase that we expect that Anglos would have. We left that off completely. We sort of merged it with Hispanics and blacks on the first one. But what would happen to the overall total if we really did get to 60% on blacks and Hispanics? And what would happen to the Anglo percent and the gap if we really got to that 60% for blacks and Hispanics? And if that's a great goal for blacks and Hispanics, percentage-wise, the increase from 2015 to 2030, starting with 22% for Hispanics, are we shooting low for females that are starting at 41%? I want to see those numbers go up for the groups that have been low, but I don't want to hold anybody down.
Right. Well, I think you've raised a very good point, and that is we have a political goal here that's a part of the overall. We're saying everybody ought to be equal, and we've picked this endpoint. But does that really challenge how realistic? Because you've raised, what happens if everybody else goes up this much? Are we saying the Anglo population didn't change? And that's why we need to get into the details of the assumptions.
Julie and I had exactly this discussion about women last week, and that we did not want to infer in any way that we would want to hold women back. But these are all sort of minimal thresholds, really. And so, African American women are far beyond where our goal was for African Americans. And so when we looked at that with closing the gaps, we had to look at that and break it down because it was masking the fact that men weren't doing well. So some of these, as we go forward, we will be breaking into even additional components. But I think it would be a good idea to go ahead and begin to systematically go through these one by one and see the relationship of them, because we do have some material prepared for you that will discuss some of these and give you the opportunity to bring up each of these issues, I think.
Right. Well, getting back to Steve's comments, and some of it may be mine, I think we've taken a top-down approach and said, here's 60% is the goal, and so we're going to coalesce every subgroup at 60%. The other approach would be, let's look at all the subgroups and let's make realistically assumptions, both as to population growth up or down and to changes in attainment rates within that, and whether it's by gender, ethnicity, or economically advantaged or disadvantaged, that's maybe a more realistic way. And of course, what we're hoping that'll come to the 60% as a conclusion, but it won't leave everybody the same. In other words, it would be rooted in historic growth, where we are today, in historic growth rates.
And is 60% a good number overall for Texas?
Well, we think so based on the studies that have been presented to us as far as where the jobs are. And actually, that job number, the new jobs, is projected to be at 65% in 2020. And so we're on a nationwide basis. So we're assuming already a more conservative number, a less aggressive number when we use 60% by 2030. New York is already, not counting certificates, is already in the 52, 53%. Massachusetts is 55, Minnesota 52. And you've got other countries, including South Korea, that are already past 60%. Canada, that's 56, 57%. So That's kind of an international goal that's been established. It's a U.S. goal that's been established by the Department of Education. I mean, we can do our own thing, and we have to a certain extent because we've got certificates in there, which not everybody includes, one, and two, we've stretched out the time frame.
And Georgetown has identified about 58% for Texas in terms of 2020,
yes.
10 years before this. So we heard that testimony early on, and that hasn't changed since then in terms of their expectations.
The reason ours is lower than the nation, though, is that they're essentially putting us into a lower wage category or less complex jobs. They're looking at where we are today and projecting forward, which that's not really an elevation, an aspirational goal, at least in my mind.
Exactly, and I think the completion actually gets us more to the aspiration, because I think that can push us beyond the educational attainment. Remember, this is 25 to 34 specifically, not the overall population.
Right. And that's another discussion, or because some of the international goals are 60% for the total population. So I think you could make an argument, as strong an argument that the goal is too low as that we could make an argument that the goal is too high.
And I'd like to remind folks, when we established Closing the Gaps and wanting to have 500,000 more students, our projections, and we'd always been within at least 2%, 2 percentage points in terms of the accuracy of our projections, were that we'd have about 230,000 more students by right now, by 2015.
Graduates, completions.
Participants, enrollments, just enrollments. And people thought that we were crazy, that there's no way we would hit 500,000. Now, in fact, we've surpassed 600,000. So part of this is, part of goals is deciding where you really need to be and finding important ways to get there, not saying how can we just happen to make it and to make the state a better place. And so it is important in a very aspirational kind of way. It's important in terms of what kind of state do we want to be. The previous commissioner, Don Brown, used to talk about the crummy future. I never understood the use of the word crummy particularly, but the crummy future if we didn't really increase participation, increase graduates that we would have in Texas, and Steve projected the much lower median family income we would have if we didn't, achieve these goals. And so this is not supposed to be easy going. It's supposed to be a challenge, and we don't want to be totally undoable. But if we look at the numbers and think, well, this should be easy, we probably are not pushing hard enough, in my view. So I leave it at that.
Okay.
Thank you, and good morning. I just want to take a moment for logistics and make sure that the web audience can view this slide that's up currently. If you go to College Town Hall, you can access the document that we're going to be looking at today. And that document is open to the public, but if you'd like to leave a comment, for those of you viewing at home or at work, you will need to sign up for College Town Hall, Texas. For those of you here, these are the two documents we'll be looking at. One is the goals and targets. It's been reformatted to better show the timeline for each target and goal. And two will be the results of the survey, and that's what will drive our discussion today. I'd like to echo Dr. Gardner's thanks for taking the survey. And the results are provided for you here. A table, a figure, and all of the comments that you provided are also in this document. So Mr. Hunt already shared this quote with you, so I won't spend too much time on it, but we want to aim high for this plan. We had 20 valid responses and a lot of comments, so I'm hoping that you will echo your comments today when we talk about the results. But let's get started. So educational attainment, the first goal. These are each of the targets, and we've just used an abbreviation here to to guide you towards this document so you can relate back to the actual target and how it's written. And we do actually have the current data posted at the end of each target. Someone asked about that a moment ago. The current data are here in italics at the end of each goal, or at the end of each target. So one of the things that might be helpful to think about is when we're looking at educational attainment, and then the next goal is completion. Right now, they share similar targets in that we're talking about gender and race and ethnicity. And one of the things we're interested to learn from you is, do you think they belong in each goal? Should they just sit in one or the other? Another thing to think about with educational attainment is we are going to be informing or watching progress towards this goal using federal data. So there's a little bit of a data lag that's going to be different than what we can measure when we look at completion. The completion goal and those targets we can measure using our state data. And someone back me up if I misspeak or correct me, please. So that's something to think about for these goals. Yes.
It would be helpful to me, at least. You've got the currently 38. It would be helpful to know what it was and pick a time, 10 years ago or something, so we know when we're looking 10 and 15 years into the future whether or not, it makes sense. To me, nothing makes sense without some background, so that we know whether we came from 30 to 38, so another 8 makes sense, or we came from 35 to 38 and we're stretching.
And I'm assuming there, or at least I'd like that also what you're saying is by each subcomponent, we'd have that same information. So whether it's Hispanic or African American, economically disadvantaged, or male or female, we would know baselines, we'd know growth rates, and then where to me it gets more complicated is obviously those groups are changing. We might have more economically disadvantaged. We may have a higher growth rate in the Hispanic population, and obviously than any other ethnic category. So, just looking at completions without knowing the components of how much of that's due to change in population changes within that component, and how much is due to increased productivity or whatever we want to label it, of having more completions, more or less completions, because you could have growth with with a lower completion rate, but a growth rate that's higher than the decline there, and you think everything's going on well, but it's all driven by growth. So at least to echo what Steve's trying to understand at that level, it would seem reasonable for the committee to have good comfort. And I think it gets back to a very good question from Ramon on bringing a convergent here where everything is 60%. We're not going to get to everything is 60% if we do this bottoms up type of approach. I mean, that can still be a goal, but it's probably not going to happen by magic at 2030.
So I'm not sure then how you'd want to proceed in terms of talking about the survey results for the targets, because it sounds like you don't feel like you have enough information to decide?
Well, I'm asking for a simple piece of information.
Right.
And that is, you've aggregated this, and obviously one of the problems that underlies it, and you know it, and there's not much to do about it, is that the weighting of who was in that is different in 2010 than it is in 2020, and it'll be a lot different than it is in 2030. But one place to start would be for us to know where we've come, to get to that 38 from, and how long in other words, give us a 10-year period or some period of time and say, okay, it was, I'll make this up, it was 30, in 2005, and in 2015 it's 38. So then we've got a 10-year period, and we can look at whether or not 52, makes a lot of sense or not.
Right. And certainly we have the request that we can prepare, but we don't have it at the ready right now.
Let me say one thing. Virtually everything that you've mentioned, we have available in our accountability system for higher ed. We don't have it for the state overall.
For the educational attainment.
And we can get that for you. But for completion, we can pull that up for you. We can, from 2000, we can tell you by each of these factors, how many graduates, we can tell you. We can do that.
Yeah, we'll find.
Larry's going to say this, but let me just add, can we discuss today, if you don't have the numbers, discuss the process? Ginger, how did you essentially get from 38 to the interim number at 45 and 52? What are assumptions? And then, of course, that maybe leads us into the subcategories. What assumptions did you make? And once we understand the process, and the numbers can come later. Larry?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I'd like to second what Steve suggested we need. We do need slope. That's basically what we need, is how we've been approaching how we've been progressing in the past. And I would recommend that we look at a 5-year differential before the present. Our future is broken into 5-year chunks, so that would make for a natural comparison. I don't think we have to have those data today to still have a useful discussion. Woody's comment about talking about how you got to the numbers you've got is a good idea. And then also, I think that people have made a lot of qualitative comments about whether to keep this target or that, and or whether to modify it. I think we can make progress on those kinds of things.
I appreciate that comment, because number one, there was the issue about whether people wanted to even consider some of these targets or not, which is why we did the survey. The second item, and what I specifically asked staff to do, was how did they calculate the 5-year increments that they have here. And then beyond that, we weren't really prepared to go back the previous 10 years, although we can in terms of easily the completion target, because we have that data readily available and can do that today. Marketable skills, of course, there just isn't any really data in terms of doing that at all, and we can do more with the student debt going back further than we have. And but part of it is we want to make sure you know how these numbers were actually calculated, and also whether you think we should even bother with some of these targets at all. And the other part, in terms of the educational attainment going back, we could use your help, Steve, in terms of the demographic information going back. And you're the most skilled person in this room in terms of that regard. But I think Ginger could actually do that if we had been prepared to do that as well.
Certainly the census or ACS data, these could be computed from relatively easily.
And we do, like Dr. Gardner said, we have that data. Not here, but we do have it. If I could, I'd like to skip ahead to completion, because we do actually walk through the targets related to Hispanic population, and that might give some insight into our thinking in terms of the methods we use to get to these numbers. It won't be a full picture, but it will offer some insight.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in here and talk a little bit about our interim targets for the Hispanic graduates, because we did have a lot of questions come in on the survey, and we understand there have been earlier questions from the committee about how we derived the interim targets as well as our final target for Hispanic graduates in terms of completion. So the chart you have in front of you, I hope, provides the type of information that you'd like to see for several of the other targets that would fit into this format. I'll walk you through what we did for Hispanic completion, and then we've got similar ones for other groups that we don't have them all prepared on slides for you for today. We do have some illustrations we could bring up. So what you see here, if you look at the second blue box that has percentages, we looked at growth from 2000 to 2013 in terms of our Hispanic completions. And from 2000 to 2006, we had 83% growth in Hispanic completions. And from 2006 to 2013, which is a 7-year span, we had 99% growth. So we saw huge jumps. You can see the actual numbers in the third column and highlighted in blue for the jumps that were made during that time. Obviously, this has all happened during closing the gaps where there was a great emphasis on increasing Hispanic completions, and our Hispanic population in higher education has grown a lot during that time as well. When it was time to think about the interim targets and the final target for Hispanic completions, we did a couple of things. The first thing we did is say, we think it'll be important for our Hispanic completions to represent, in terms of the percentages, to represent the total percent of awards. So the percent of Hispanics earning awards would represent the percent of Hispanics in our target population, which for this we looked at a 25 to 34-year-old population. And we determined that in 2020, 46%, we're projected to have 46% of the population of that age be Hispanic. And so we looked at, okay, then what would our numbers need to be to have 46% of the awards that we are giving in 2020 be to Hispanic students. And that brought us to a very high number of 175,000 of the awards for 2020. Then we looked at, well, how much of an increase is that? That's a huge jump from our 84,000 in 2013. And we said, well, that's 7 years. And you can see we did look at 2006 to 2013 to see what happened in 7 years. We had a 99% increase. Well, it's going to take a 107% increase to go from where we were in 2013 to 2020. So that's a little bit more ambitious than what we've seen in the past, and we know we've seen really high jumps in the past, but that's what we decided to use when we first looked at this goal, and we thought it would be wonderful to be ambitious in the beginning, to really try to achieve even greater growth than we've seen, and then we can move on to 2030 and continue to have the Hispanic awards represent the percent of the Hispanic population. Yes?
Julie, the word award here, that means that's a degree,
a degree or certificate. That's correct. Degrees and certificates combined.
Financial aid.
No, not financial aid. No, thank you very much for clarifying that. So one thing we did when we've just recently gotten our 2014 data certified and been able to look at our 2014 degrees and awards, we looked for the last couple of weeks as we've been really focusing on this, we looked what we've done for the last couple of years in terms of our percent increase for Hispanic degrees and awards, and it's slowed down. We've slowed down to, we had a 5% increase from 2012 to 2013, and we had a 6%, a little bit more increase from 2013 to 2014. So as we looked at that data, and we looked at the fact that it was very ambitious to say, hey, in those first 7 years from 2013, we want to actually be in parity in terms of the population. When we looked at those new numbers, we said that may be a little too ambitious. And it may be more appropriate to spread the growth for this particular target over the 3-year periods, the 2020, 25, and 2030, or the 3 separate years, rather than how it was done. But I think initially when we were first looking at completion, and we first gave you these numbers last summer, we looked at the past data, as you suggested. We saw that tremendous growth, and we said, let's be ambitious. Let's think about if we can continue that and get to parity. That means you get more students getting out into the population with degrees, with that attainment level earlier on. And so that's where we came up with the numbers. But a lot of the determining these interim targets was to put something in front of you. We have rationales behind all the different ones, but to put something out there for discussion. And I think this actually raises a lot of interesting discussion in terms of, first of all, how far we've come over time, but also where we expect to go. And I know Dr. Ferguson mentioned, diminishing returns and will things get saturated. We don't know over time what we're going to see as our percentages grow. I think that's an important part of the conversation. But again, I do think it's important for us to understand for the Hispanic population. Our Hispanic population is growing in Texas. We do have population projections that show that, and we think it's very important that by 2030 that our completions our degrees and certificate completions are represent the Hispanic population is comprising the same percentage of those as they are in the state. Or moving forward, we're really going to be in trouble as the population continues to shift.
Yeah. Can I ask you, did you look at this is the middle scenario, it's the slow growth scenario.
The 0.5 scenario, yes.
Yeah, the 1.0 scenario, which would be what we've had from 2000 to 2010, is 1.0. Did you look to see what would happen if the growth is at that level?
We did not use that scenario. For now, it was our understanding that growth was slowing, and we were thinking that the 0.5 scenario was more appropriate based on what discussions that we'd had. It's certainly something that we can look at.
Steve, this is the very point I was bringing up earlier. When I saw this, I wondered if we were being too conservative, actually, in this case.
We're going to have to break for lunch, but just one last comment before we do. It seems to me we need to understand at the committee level, and getting back to Larry's comments and Steve's comments on slope and historical data, we need to see what the population, within the subcomponent of the Hispanic population, we need to see what's the population, for the forecasted 25 to 34-year-olds, what's the growth in that population over time, and then what's the rate, per capita in terms of completions, to see what's the slope of that. And so if we've got we know we have an increasing population. We can debate whether it's which of the 2 or 3 forecasts that are out there, and maybe we could look at it under all of those. But then we need to know what the slope is on the completion rate per capita, and the combination of those two need to be able to come back, and we need to deliver whether it's 175 or some other number on what we think that can contribute to the overall completion goal.
Yes, and we actually developed a couple of slopes as we were working on this that we can share with you, but there's probably more that we need to do. But in terms of looking over time, I think we started in '98 with one and 2000 with another. So we'll share those. And
so let's go ahead and break, because the food has been here and it's going to get cold. Let's bring it back to the table and we can continue this discussion.
Most of the completion goals and then some of the others, it would be helpful to staff if we go through and talk about what targets we really want to keep and which ones we don't, so that we don't spend a lot of time chasing down a rabbit hole that nobody wants.
I'd like to just make the following, at least my personal view here. One, that the 60% target for the completions in the 25 to 34-year-old age group has largely been determined externally as the percentage that we need, minimum. I would describe it as the minimum number that we need to be globally competitive in terms of the workforce. And so I don't feel uncomfortable at all if we as a state are focused on being globally competitive. That's somewhere close. That's our best information today about what the best number would be. I do think we need to build a consensus around that number, but also the committee needs to have a consensus on whether the approach that the coordinating board has taken, where we have this convergence in 2030, or as we talked before lunch, or as you saw with our presentation this morning, the female rate started exceeding the male rate in terms of completions in the early 1960s. That's 50 years ago. For us to think that somehow, and we also saw that the policies or what's happening are largely in the K through 12 system and not in higher education. So for us to believe that by 2030 that we're going to have gender neutrality doesn't seem realistic to me. So more realistic, I think, is using our best judgment, as we talked before lunch, on growth rates and size of subpopulations, and how effective we think we can be in completions, participations, and ultimate completions within those subgroups, and then from that we build, hopefully, to where we can support the 60% goal. So I see the 60% is externally our best understanding of what it takes to be globally competitive. we go to look at the subcomponents to see if we can get there, and then what kind of strategies that we think that the state will need to support to be able to get there. And as far as the goals that we have out there right now, by gender, by ethnicity, and also by economically disadvantaged, I think are all appropriate goals. We might ultimately, as Lori pointed out, the economically disadvantaged might end up being the most important overall goal, but I think that's still yet for us to discuss with staff and within the committee. With that, I'd open it up to other comments from the committee, or we can look to the staff to continue.
I think the most important thing to understand today is, and from what you said, it sounded like you may accept each of these as targets. We still need to figure out what the actual numbers should be for each of the 5-year increments, and that's what we need to understand so we can give you much more detail in terms of defining what you need for 2020, 2025, and 2030. But if you see, as we look at these and we see, 8 people said maybe on the Hispanic target, we weren't quite sure why people thought maybe, and it's sounding to me like people were reacting more to the specific target numbers than to whether we had it as a target at all. Is that correct? I can't tell.
Your microphone, Steve.
I said I think the response we got for most of us is that we were just picking yes or no to a number without having context for it. And I think having context that said this is how well we did from 2000 to 2010 for African Americans, for Hispanics, for low income, etc., would have been, then I think would have been, at least I would have been able to give a better response to whether that made sense.
So you confirmed what I just thought was the case, is that we didn't really pose the question, well, we were really wondering, did you want the general notion of a target for Hispanics at all? And then we would get down to the specifics in terms of the numbers, but you were acting specifically to the numbers within the target. Right. And so we didn't pose that well enough. We actually were asking you 2 questions inadvertently rather than one. So that's our fault.
But don't you have to have targets?
We do need to have targets.
But even by category?
Well, I think we do. But what I've surmised from the discussion today, and if the rest of you agree with what Steve said, you were reacting to the specific number for the Hispanic target for 2020 and 2025 and 2030, rather than that should we have a target for Hispanics at all. You don't see the distinction in what I'm saying?
If we don't have a target for Hispanics, I would not have been driving the death trap I-35. I mean, there'd be no point in being here. I mean, we might as well just say, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great experience. Larry, wonderful lunches. Thank you for getting those funded. I mean, we have to have the targets. It's whether these are they stretch? Maybe that's kind of where people are they stretch? Mm-hmm. Or are they so beyond stretch?
Okay.
That there is no sense of reality. You have to have some things can be aspirational, but there has to be there has to be an infrastructure to say es posible. Okay.
This is probably my misreading of the committee at the end of the last meeting, because at the end of the last meeting, I felt there was a lot of question about whether we should include certain targets at all, regardless of the numbers, and why I suggested we actually do a polling so that we can narrow it down and make sure. So it sounds like it was really about the specific numbers. Would that pertain to all the targets through this whole survey, that all of you thought they were the right kind of targets, you just weren't sure about the numbers?
No. I mean, I think they're all, obviously gender and ethnicity and economically disadvantaged, there's overlaps there. I would certainly feel comfortable we working on all of them at this moment in time. Our policy recommendations ultimately might get to economically disadvantaged, and that will end up disproportionately impacting Hispanics and African Americans. It probably won't do much on our gender, but it could, into a better understanding there. But I think at this time we should be looking at all of those because it helps explain the challenge that we have. But once again, the policy recommendations might end up being on a broader category, which cuts across all of them, which economically disadvantaged would fall into that category.
Sorry, Woody. Are we already globally competitive within certain cohorts?
If you're talking about at 60%, no.
I mean, our Asian student population is probably globally competitive, right? I mean, I'm just wondering if we can narrow our focus to those who are impacting the mission or the goal most.
I think we're probably globally competitive among children of well-off, college-educated parents.
I think that's exactly on target, and
Well, that's a real upper.
and the categories aren't as relevant in some other places as are in Texas, because this reflects whether our entire population is participating or not, and our entire population has a bearing on whether we're going to be competitive. Some other countries, there'll be very few Asians. There'll be very few Hispanics.
And they're changed, and I think to answer Bernie's question, David, is the reason it's all relevant and why we need to target everything is because the composition of our population is changing so dramatically over not that long of a period of time. So even though the Anglo population of this state is slightly better educated than the national average, so I would call it, that it is globally competitive, and the Asian population in this state is slightly better educated than the national Asian population, so I would call that globally competitive. The fact that one's very small and the other's actually declining tells me that we need to pay attention to the other categories, and so we need to really pay attention to all of them. I don't see how we avoid doing that because the change is so dramatic.
I think the major issue here is the fact that the whole has to equal the sum of the parts. And so if we start working with the parts, they have to sum up to whatever the final goal is.
Yeah, and I second that. That was the one thing that I'm not an accountant, but internally, do all the pieces equal to the whole? I mean, and how does that affect the 60%? And then the other thing was the thing that was brought up a little earlier. Then you're really just backing into the goal for everybody else, basically. I mean, because this doesn't include. I guess it includes everybody if you include gender, but.
Well, there is an inherent assumption that in terms of our Asian American population, at least with the current data, we don't have any concerns that we're not going to have enough educated, that a high enough percentage of the Asian American population won't be as educated, although there are certain suggestions that the longer you're in the U.S., the more the Asian American population in some cases will become like American students. White population is still doing better, but what we have here are groups that are not participating as fully and graduating to the same extent, and we need to be certain that they are fully participating if we're going to succeed as a part of that whole that was mentioned. This is about the whole. I think Steve may want to contribute something here.
The only thing I would say is that the educational differentials, the socioeconomic differentials are so different by race, ethnicity, that I think we have to look at the components and add them up to get the total rather than to the total and try to do something else with it. Because we're talking about completion rates that are tremendously different. We're talking about age structures that are tremendously different. We're talking about one group that percentage-wise is, disappearing from 40-some% over the next 40 years to 21%. while other groups grow, and if we don't do it by the components and add those up to get the total, I don't know what we're going to have. If we take the total and then we're going to end up having to go back and try to make the parts, and the parts are going to look very strange in order to get just the total.
I mean, I think we're ultimately trying to find out where those slopes are, and is there an intervention from a policy standpoint that can move the slope. But first, we need to be able to make the case of where we think best we're going with what we have in place based on the demographic changes. And then out of that would become potential policy interventions to move the slopes to try to change the outcomes to get to the 60%. So, and Steve, would you agree that, I mean, trying to assume that all this is going to coalesce in 2030 is not realistic, and that we need to focus on those subcomponents and what we think is going to happen to them, and then we can see what it looks like in 2030?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to meet all the goals for every one of these groups are all going to be 60% or 70% or whatever we set. I think we've got to look at progress in each group. We'd like it to all be the same, obviously, and then make our total be a weighted sum of the four groups. And if we want to make it 60, then we got to figure out how to do some big things with some groups.
Yes, Laura.
I think what we're struggling with is it's not the number or the numbers that we're setting. It's the economic impact. And if we look at the subgroups, do we make a more significant economic impact if we take middle class and or white and or Asian and or Hispanic or black, middle class, and raise that level or the numbers or percentages of completion? Or is it more impactful if we take the lowest socioeconomic or lower socioeconomic groups of students? Because that's who we're getting into the K-12 system, are more and poorer students. And these kids are not coming in neat little kindergarten packages. They're coming from other countries, that are they're coming into 8th grade or 5th grade, and they've never been to school. So we're getting poor kids who aren't literate, and we're trying to figure out how we can make an economic impact on this state. It seems to me that we ought to put our biggest focus on where we can make the biggest difference. Does that make sense?
Well, I think we need to let the data lead us to where we're going, and maybe that data will show that that's what we need to that's what I was saying earlier, try to recommend maybe economically disadvantaged as a category will be where we'll end up making policy recommendations. But I don't think we have the data yet to at the committee level to be able to answer that question.
And would our data in this state be significantly different than data in any other state if we're going to be nationally or internationally competitive? If we're looking at Germany, for example, as our speaker said, is that a comparison? Or Finland, as everybody throws out, they don't have the same socioeconomics. You can't compare it. It's not apples to apples.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is that so many times when people do international comparisons, they take these very uniform, non-diverse populations, and small populations, Norway, Sweden, etc. They're the size of states, and we look at them and compare them to us and say, my goodness, we're not doing as well as the Norwegians are on such and such. And that's true, but they aren't like us in lots of ways. We've got to, I agree with Lori, I think we've got to do it with the population we have. And I think if we did it by each of the four racial and ethnic groups, we would take into account not all, but a lot of the low-income issues would come bubbling through.
Now, the scary part of our challenge to me is we could outperform in terms of completions in every racial and ethnic group, outperform the U.S., but yet when we roll it all up, we will be significantly below. I mean, that's kind of where we are today as a state. It's not that we don't outperform and we don't in the Hispanic, but we do in African American, we do in Asian, we do in the white population. But when you put them all together, because we have a different profile than the rest of the country
Exactly.
in terms of ethnicity, we become significantly less competitive. So, I mean, we have a special challenge.
Yeah, but a lot of that challenge is the numbers. A lot of the challenge is because the 200-pound gorilla happens to be Hispanic in this case, and that group is growing very rapidly, and is I think one of the groups that we need to give the greatest consideration to in terms of changing our state and helping them become competitive will make the state competitive.
Steve, I think you might be saying that on a resource allocation basis per capita, the low income or Hispanic or possibly even the black cohort we'd allocate more on a per capita basis to solve the challenge. Are you saying that?
I'm not a policymaker, but I've certainly, if you look, certainly that's the way I would say that the reality is. In other words, if those of us, a bunch of us have taught here, but, I almost can't teach too badly to take the upper middle class kid that's been to prep school and everything else. I almost can't be bad enough teacher not for that kid to do well, okay? On the other hand, for the kid who's never been to college, before, never had a parent that's been in college, never had a sibling that's been in college, walks in, has done all right in high school, but maybe the math, and here I'm talking personally, and the math that they had in school was not taught by the best teacher because it was one of those schools where every teacher stayed 1 year. They either got fired or they were good enough to go to some other place. Those kind of differences make a difference in terms of performance, and if you want to overcome those, I'd argue we would need to differentially fund schools, not on the basis of just head count, and I know that's probably impossible to do politically, but to look at it in terms of needs and what it will take to raise this kid from here to there. You almost can, frankly, you can go to some upper middle class suburban schools and you almost can't be bad enough to make anything but good things happen in that school. On the other hand, it takes a lot of work to make a difference when a kid has, kids that parents that have never been to college, never had a role model of a college graduate, has had poor teachers, and who may have a language problem as well. It's going to take more resources to bring that kid up to where we want it to be than it is going to take for my upper middle class grandson.
So, for the record, Steve, you are saying that black, brown, and low income kids need more time and money than perhaps the Anglo cohort.
Well, that would be my view, but since I have no political or any kind of power, I don't think it's very relevant. But I think that differential in funding is one of the realities of, and in a sense we do that, but we haven't done very well, I don't think. Yeah. But that's a personal opinion.
And there was just a statement the other day or a story about it's been 25 years since the legislature has raised the formula differential for ESL English as a second language students. So if we're talking about this population, back to what Laurie said and Steve said, so they're going to fall into economically disadvantaged, but their English is a second language. So 25 years since we've said we will increase the allocation from the state of Texas per pupil by this much to assist you in helping this child overcome these language barriers. 25 years. And I know our roads are bad, but anyway.
And there's one other figure I'll add to that, and that is if you read the New Texas Challenge book, which I know that all of you have bought for your friends and family.
Oh, who wrote that?
I don't know. But the one figure in there that I think is to me, all kidding aside, which is very telling, is that from 2000 to 2010, we decreased on a per capita basis state funding for higher education by 28%. And then, of course, we turned around and parents said, why is tuition going up? I can't figure out why they had to raise tuition, why they had to raise such and such. And, of course, that happened because, we took away.
Steve, you've formed a little segue into one of the reasons that I like to see some trend data, because I got some trend data on the state appropriation that goes into the weighted credit hours that's used for the formula. And in year 2000 and 2001, it was $54.44. In 2016-17, it's $54.86. So it's increased 42 cents in 15 years. Now,
don't take into account
then you
inflation.
just decry the fact that tuition's going up. How else can you fund something over a 15-year period when the state appropriation for credit hour is, a weighted credit hour is flat? So, to me, that's one of the biggest barriers that we have, and it just fits into this whole conversation, is how can we make the higher education affordable to those people that really need it? Laurie?
And what I'd like to interject is that currently there's a school finance lawsuit, not the first and probably not the last, that is being discussed now and certainly will, continue to be discussed all the way to the Supreme Court about funding in public education being not only inadequate but inequitable. And we are growing in this state a student population the size of Fort Worth ISD every single year. And so the argument is that as we're getting 80,000 more kids a year, where are they going and who are they? And this is what's going to drive our decision. And I agree with you, it's the data. It's the data that will drive it, but where can we make the most impact, and who are those kids that we're trying to impact?
Okay, David, we're ready to go back to your presentation.
Are you sure? Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've addressed educational attainment. Let's go into something where we have more data, which is the completions. And if we need to, I'm sure we can call up the accountability system and provide more background on some of these data than we have prepared. So who's doing this?
Julie, I guess I'll go call up accountability.
Yeah,
and
Julie's going to.
Okay. Go do that.
We've already walked you through the data we had for Hispanics regarding completion to try to give you some insight into what we've been thinking. But as per your request, we will flesh that out in more detail and share it with you in a way that hopefully will make sense to everyone. But on completion, in particular, we had a lot of maybes. And so the comments for both attainment and completion showed a mix of responses where some folks seemed uncomfortable with the number, as we've been talking about, but others seemed uncomfortable with having the target at all by subgroup. And so we're wondering how much that plays out in completion as well. Again, the maybes are the lighter red or the orange color, and there were a lot of maybes in completion, and we weren't really sure how to interpret that substantively. If that was a vote, a nice vote of no confidence, or if it was a genuine, I need more information. Or maybe it was a genuine, I just don't know if this is necessary under the completion goal.
Well, I mean, I was one of those maybes, and it was not because I didn't believe that we needed to have those sub-goals, but I didn't understand, as laid out here, what the assumptions were being used to get there, and also the concept of all of them coming together at a point in time.
Well, it seems like the discussion so far is all of the targets are valuable for each of the goals. I just did want to point out that some of the comments reflected opinions where they didn't think the target was valuable at all. And I want to make sure that as a group, we still want to keep them.
Okay. So the group's been asked a question. I certainly feel comfortable in trying to decompose and understand the data. It doesn't bar us at some point in the future of narrowing it in our final report, but I think we're still in an information and understanding phase, and that we shouldn't be afraid to look at all of the data and slice it as many different ways as possible. Fundamentally, though, needing to understand how what are the underlying assumptions there. Yes, Larry.
I might have been a maybe. I don't know what I was actually, but on a lot of these goals, my reaction was that in this area, completion, that having all the racial, ethnic goals and others, that we were in effect duplicating what was in the first section, which is what do you call it? Educational attainment. It seemed to me having that set of goals in both places it produced a kind of cluttered report, it seemed like to me, that we didn't need to keep track of all of that in both places. We could do it in one or the other, but I'm not sure we need to do it in both. On the other hand, Woody's arguing right now we ought to just keep track of it because we want to see what works out to be the best picture. But that was, at the heart of my reaction was really the sense of that it ought to be one place or the other.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And the difference between the two places is, in terms of completion, this actually has to do with the production of the institutions in the state. Under educational attainment, it's not just production in the state, but it's in-migration, out-migration, all of those things. And so I think if there's a place where we really need to hold ourselves accountable, it's really in the completion section. And it takes into account participation, it takes into account what each sector is doing in higher education. We need to not lose sight of the fact that this is a higher ed plan, and this is higher ed's contribution to the educational attainment.
Well, I think that's an important point, David, and I think as the report's composed, you might want to make that point explicitly in the report.
Yes.
But if you were to collapse those two, we need to take at least two of them from the completion, having to do, from the second page, the two in the middle are not included in the first one, having to do with attainment. The one on increasing the percent of public school graduates enrolling and increasing the percent of economically disadvantaged graduates taking at least 12 dual credit hours. And to answer the earlier question, I don't have a problem at all with any of the items or with the percents I did at the beginning, but I was concerned about the gaps. But I think at least mathematically, it seems to me that it's a lot easier to increase something from 22% up than it is to increase something from 45% up. Also, there are two words in there in the attainment and in the completion that gives me a lot of satisfaction. One of them, the two words are at least. Like when we're saying at least 60%, we're not holding anybody back. I'm more concerned, and we could spend a lot of time looking at percents and numbers and what's the right number and what's the right target. I'm more concerned about the strategies and to make sure that we're using the right strategies, and at some point that somebody's going to fund those strategies to get to the targets. You can have all the targets you want in the world. If we don't put the money out there and we don't have the right strategies, we're not going to get anywhere.
Well, I would suggest that, given that's the case, if you'd like to move, we can move quickly through the targets and reach some resolution, and all the strategies that at least have come up, we have in another document here, and we can address those today as well.
And we can bring you additional, we would be able to bring you some more in-depth in the tenure, looking at the data for each of those targets before the next meeting.
There is a relationship between the two, but so we could, if you're comfortable with all the targets, at least aside from the numbers that we have here, we can either go through those in the other goals, or we can go directly to the document for completion and talk about the strategies that have been identified thus far. Then we can go to the marketable skills and talk about the targets there, and then talk about the strategies that have been identified thus far. It's up to the chair. We can go either route.
I defer to you if you think it's the right way to do it.
Okay, well, let's then focus on whether you agree with all the targets conceptually, aside from the exact numbers here, and whether you want to include them, and then we'll walk through the strategies that you guys have identified in your groups, and then we'll move to the next goal, if that's okay with you guys.
Larry?
Yeah, I questioned target number, I don't remember which one it is, but anyway, the one on increase the percentage of all public high school graduates enrolling in a public, independent, or for-profit college or university within 1 year. I mean, I can see why we have that sort of constitutionally, but right now it's at 54%, and we're going to try to get it to 60%. It seems like there's
disconnect.
It's just not enough of a movement to make it a target.
And it seemed to me to be because I have the same comment that it's inconsistent with, our significant completion that our productivity has gotten that much better in higher education. I mean, the graduation rates would have to be significantly higher, by a pretty significant factor than they are now for that level of participation to deliver that level of completion that we're forecasting. I didn't understand the math. I mean, that was my.
Well, let's see what everyone else thinks, and perhaps we should exclude that one. I think one thing that's not understood now is, with the advent of HB5, will we continue even at the same rate we are, or not, given the change in the structure of the high school curriculum? And so that's sort of an unknown right now. If we were continuing with the same high school curriculum, I think it's a little bit more predictable what's going forward, and I think this reflects that. So, but that's something we could put on the side and just monitor that as we go forward, and not include it as a target.
This also takes into account something that Ms. Bricker's been talking about, where you're getting to where more and more of the public education system is low income. So this took into account that you're going to be getting that percentage of their graduating class that is low income is growing. It's about 60% right now, and expected to go up to probably close to 80% the last thing I looked at.
But you already have that in the preceding target, Susan.
All right, you're talking about in the like in the completion?
The one on the Pell Grant, the target on the Pell Grant basically gets you that.
It's built into that, and I think that's a good point. So how do people feel we can, at least for now, eliminate this as a target? No disagreement, it sounds like?
I think we need to consider, as we said earlier, adding one target, and that's in terms of the percentage of college-ready high school graduates.
That's a more meaningful target.
And Raymond, you might want to comment, because we talked earlier, I mean, that kind of crosses the line into the TEA area, but all of our pipeline discussions ultimately are not successful if we don't have a better percentage of college-ready students?
Well, as Lori and I have talked about this many times, we could talk about setting all kinds of ambitious goals for completions in higher education, but if K through 12 doesn't do its job, we'll never get there. A couple of things come to mind, and I'm sorry I missed the earlier discussions about these issues. The percentage of poor kids and students of color that are going to college has increased dramatically over the past 25, 30 years. What hasn't increased dramatically is the completion rate for these same groups. So I like the focus on completion. I was looking at some data recently. I used the data in my State of Higher Education address. Texas, over 60% of the kids in K through 12 in Texas are poor, and that number is increasing. In fact, Michael Williams, the Commissioner of Education, told me recently that the number is actually closer to 65. Pair that with another statistic, which I saw in some of the the Pew data. And they point out that Texas is 42nd among the states in sending poor kids to college. Those are in South Texas, for example, in the Rio Grande Valley, the percentage of high school graduates that are college ready across all disciplines is calculated by ACT is 14%. Statewide, it's 24%. So to me, it seems the issues are completion and college readiness, particularly by poor kids. And I think looking at the category of poor kids subsumes poor Hispanic and African American kids.
I second your new target.
Okay.
So does he.
Okay, so just so you'll know that currently the Texas Education Agency is working on their accountability system, and one of the measures is percent of college-ready students. Also, there's been a bill introduced that would require that all 10th grade students take the Texas Success Initiative exam, which is a college readiness exam. So there would be reading that would be consistent with what we have in place for our colleges and universities, if that passes. So that would make this measurable in a clear-cut kind of way. That plus the exemption scores on the SAT and ACT, which we can get access to, we would get a good feel for that. So that we will add that. That would be a very good measure, a very good target.
So the 24, David, and the 14% now come from ACT scores?
Yes.
And which are not universally taken, so there's a sampling. Or how do you come to the conclusion it's 24% of high school graduates are college ready?
Well, they can calculate what percentage of high school juniors and seniors are taking the ACT, and then they know the number of graduates, and they can extrapolate from
So
there.
it's a sampling type of projection.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's important to point out that there are more students who take the ACT in Texas now than there are to take the SAT.
The ACT's done a lot of really good research on college readiness.
Yes.
I think.
Yes, D.
We just started at El Paso Independent School District funding for the ACT for all juniors. It had never been done before. So we're mandating that all of the students take the ACT.
You're paying for it.
We're paying for it. So we started so we could see what kind of stats come out. But, no, they're not prepared. They're not college ready.
And I think the ACT is a better test to measure college readiness because it's content-based.
Currently, we have for fall 13, there were 73% of the high school graduates were ready in all three areas.
And that included performance.
ACT?
No, this is
using the
our
TSI.
and
yes.
our tests.
Which means that would not include students who are already exempt based upon an ACT or
No,
SAT.
this is
No, that includes
exempt,
everyone.
Exempt and enrolled, or exempt
Oh,
and
you're
passed.
including both.
Yeah. So So whether they exempted out of the test or they passed the test when they took it, we have about 73%, 72.6.
We see much lower readiness rates for the students who aren't coming directly from high school in our data.
So
that's one notion that gets lost in the discussions is our biggest problem with developmental ed students who have been out of high school a few years. Though we still have the problem with high school, but it's not
as bad.
As bad.
Do you all have the data on dual credit, the number of hours of dual credit that also show the propensity to complete college, attend college and complete college?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, that somehow ought to be factored in if we're talking about readiness coming out of high school.
Yeah, one thing.
They're supposed to be ready before they take the dual credit. Well, I know, but they're required to be, with some exemptions, college ready to take a dual credit course. Well, I'm not. Well, college readiness is a real subject of discussion. I can tell you that the exempt scores for the SAT, our general counsel's sons and my daughters had surpassed that by about 200 points when they were 12 years old. And we wouldn't think they were college ready. So it's how much can you really take advantage of your college? But that they're at least marginally prepared to succeed, and we have evidence of that they are. But we do know that there's some cases where students have enrolled in dual credit where they have not demonstrated college readiness on TSI or another measure.
You know, we get caught up in the difference between dual credit and early college. There's a difference. We're trying to do some early college within high schools right now and some of that, but that's all got to filter down. And Woody's right. If we don't work it on the secondary level, we're not going to have anything to impact on the higher ed.
Now, number 7, you tie dual credit to participation. Do we also have data on dual credit and completion?
We do, and that's one of the reasons we have that included. And this one is for the economically disadvantaged, because we see in the data that we have that economically disadvantaged students are less likely to be taking dual credit. We see a big correlation or big boost for those economically disadvantaged students who are taking dual credit and enroll. They're such a much higher proportion of those students go ahead and enroll in higher ed. So we think that if we can help push that to where you're getting some of those economically disadvantaged, they go into college, they see that they can do it, and they do tend to continue on in higher ed. And so we see a really good return on that.
Yeah, I think
so that's why we.
And this was a direct request by someone on the committee. So.
I think we provided that data earlier that something like 42% of economically disadvantaged students go straight on to higher ed, but it's in the 80 percentages for those students who did at least 12 hours of dual credit who are economically disadvantaged.
And we've got the completion rates, or we have.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, we do. We have it. We actually have some information in our almanac about completion for students who've done dual credit, and online we have a lot of that information also that we can share.
Julia actually has a report which shows a calculated grade point for them once they enrolled in a particular college as well.
Yes, we've looked at how those students perform when they get to college. We looked at their completion rates, but because students are expected for academic dual credit to meet certain readiness standards, certain eligibility standards, we do see that they perform better. But some of that is some of those students would perform better because they were eligible for college courses in high school. If you follow that, but we believe there's also an impact of students being in those courses, and we see real growth when we track those students.
So any questions about any of the other targets? So I think at this point we're adding a target in terms of the percent of college ready, and I think we're eliminating the one in terms of what number is that?
6.
6? Is that correct? Okay, so if you have another document where you had the the strategies that you had proposed up until this point for completion.
Let me clarify with Larry. Did you want to eliminate the participation, or were you questioning, that the difference was so small that it didn't really seem like
Doesn't seem like a target. It's because it's so small a change, percentage-wise. I mean, I don't doubt that it's an important number, but when you're saying to the public that your goal is to go from 53% to 60%, does it really stand as a significant enough target relative to the other things you have on the list?
And my question was, it seemed inconsistent with the completions we were expecting to have that small of an increase in participation. So I still think leaving it on there, but maybe revisiting, can we really achieve a 60% completion in the 25 to 34-year-olds if our participation rate in higher education is 60%?
Now, I think
I understand there's some immigration, there's some other factors there, but ultimately you would think that the participation rate has got to be higher than the completion rate. Significantly so.
Well, and one thing you need to understand is that the first time entering students that go into a community college is straight from high school is at less than about half of their entering class. So that's only half of your entering class for the community college side. It's about 80-85% at the universities, maybe a little higher. But for community colleges, straight directly from high school into first time in college.
Okay. So there's a significant population in higher education that are not picked up in the participation.
That are not directly from high school.
Or the way this is defined.
Also, the biggest area for gain is to be more successful with helping students complete that actually enroll in college. If we just keep the same relationship between people enrolling and people graduating, we're still taking a lot of money from people. We're investing in a lot of people without them having their success. So one thing that's happened in closing the gaps, even though we haven't hit our participation number, is we've done dramatically better in terms of Hispanics graduating once they've enrolled. And so what we really need to do is to do much better with all those students we enroll in terms of actually receiving a credential, whether it's a certificate, a bachelor's, or a master's degree, than we do now. Because each one of them is committing a significant amount of resources, are going into debt, without reaping the real reward for that. And the state's invested hundreds of millions of dollars in students who have not completed. So we have to be very serious about that end of the bargain.
Well,
and I think that's why you wanted to focus on completion in the beginning rather than,
Admittedly, that's what one of the perfect studies to look at, like as a case study, would be KIPP. They have admitted that they can get any kid into college. They can successfully get any kid into college, but they found that those students were not college ready, and that has been their biggest challenge. But I want to go back to what Susan said, because I'm confused by it. When you were talking about those that are entering community college, I was under the impression, data in the back of my mind, that almost 70% of all incoming freshmen enter at community college level. So tell me what you just said.
Okay, that 70% of incoming freshmen doesn't mean they're directly from high school. So of your high school graduates, about half go to a university and about half go to a community college. That half at a community college, they've got another. That's only about half of the entering class at a community college. They have another half of theirs that have been out of high school for a while, adults coming back, that sort of thing.
Okay, I get it. I get it. Thank you.
Military.
It's interesting. If we haven't done this recently, but in the past, if you track those same high school graduates out another 6 years, you'd find a pretty high percent of them had enrolled at least for a course after another 6 years in a college. That participation rate measured that way is much higher than one would think, but they're not. The people actually receiving a credential is not really that high. Even though we've made big strides in terms of completions, we still have a long way to go.
If we were to make a dent in dual credit, a significant dent, then we would overcome the entering freshmen that are graduating from high school, or even those that haven't graduated yet, because they would already be enrolled in college and well on their way to some sort of certificate at the very least. At the very least.
And I just actually pulled up some of our dual credit data that we have here. And for the 2004 first-time in college students who had dual credit, in 5 years, 72% of those that had at least 31 hours of dual credit had graduated, earned a bachelor's or associate within 5 years. And for those with 1 to 11, it was 55%. So
those are not necessarily economically disadvantaged?
no, this is just our general dual credit hours. But you see roughly the same thing when you look at the economically disadvantaged. It's slightly lower, but it's really very good for those students to be getting.
The number of students that are economically disadvantaged is smaller.
Right.
The percents are similar, but the numbers actually participating are smaller, and that's what whoever suggested this particular target was trying to get at, increasing the number of economically disadvantaged students who actually
are taking that dual credit.
90% of EPISD is economically disadvantaged.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what we have in dual credit, you're going to have economically disadvantaged.
Right.
Not in the IP baccalaureate, but you will in the disadvantage. But also, isn't there some ratio I understood where if you took like 2 hours or 4 hours or something, the chances of your matriculating to college have increased geometrically, something like that, in dual credit is what I think I was hearing something like that, which gives them, we're at least getting them there.
Mm-hmm. We definitely see higher enrollments for students who have participated in dual credit after they complete high school.
And there are a number of factors involved in that. It isn't strictly the course, it's that the student's receiving some attention, that people are noting that they're capable. There are a lot of things that go along with enrolling in that dual credit course. Aside from knowing, sort of teaching them that they're capable of doing it, somebody is telling them they're capable. They've been identified, they're more likely to get some guidance from someone. I think it's a mistake to disregard those other benefits that come along with actually taking the course.
Are any of these groups impacted more by veterans enrolling, and particularly by those in the Hazelwood exemption program?
We haven't actually looked at the exemptions. I'm starting to actually do quite a bit of looking at the exemptions given what just happened for the Hazelwoods and that sort of stuff. But we can look at that.
That might be another group that we might want to look at, make sure that they're included, especially they're impacting the older generation of students. They're also probably coming in with some credit.
They usually do. Mm-hmm. And we do have a couple of institutions. I know TSTC, and Rex is going to have to correct me on the other one. There's another one that is doing a lot of work with aligning the training that they get in the military with the credits
it's
and
Central
getting
Texas
them
College.
Okay, Central Texas, to where they're getting some college credit for the training they got in the military.
And Texas Workforce Commission is working with them as well. What is it? College for Heroes, I believe.
College
credit for Heroes.
College Credit for Heroes.
Yeah, you'd ask us to look at strategies, and I know they're broader, but are we hiding dual credit somewhere here or early college? Hiding dual credit, early college, yada, yada, under one of these very broad, save the world, support academic preparation, guide students, yada, yada. Or do we dare to be bold and use those words?
We should. If we have bold strategies that can make a difference, we should put them on paper and pursue them.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner.
Do you have a bold strategy?
Turn the mic off. God, please.
Okay, so are we keeping or eliminating that target? I didn't. The one on the increasing the percentage of high school graduates moving on.
Economically disadvantaged.
No, this one.
Number 6.
Number
Yeah.
6.
And adding in the
I thought we were eliminating it, but I think you're arguing not to eliminate it.
He's the chairman.
Well, and I guess is there a proxy for participation that would be helpful? I'm asking. I'm just asking the question there. I mean, maybe this is not as good a proxy because of those that come in later. So, I mean, I've been one who's always been on the other side, focused on completions, not on enrollment. Changed the formula for performance funding, but you've got to be enrolled if you're going to complete. So, do we need a proxy for enrollment? Is what I'm asking, and I don't know whether this is the best proxy or the best date.
Well, you said proxy for enrollment. We could actually have a target for enrollments.
Right, and that's right. Yeah, I mean, we can move from here. If the intent here was to try to be a proxy for enrollment, maybe the best guide is just enrollment itself, which would be all inclusive and would pick up the adult portion of the student population.
It would. We can work on one for next time that does that if you'd like. We'll do that.
I'll be glad to.
Where are we at?
I have that we're going to change, and somebody can correct me because this has been a little convoluted, that we're going to work on a target for enrollment in general, and we could either do it total enrollment or we could look at undergraduate enrollment. Or both. Both is always better, right?
Would enrollment include dual credit? That's enrollment.
That is enrollment.
Not first time in college,
Yes.
so they're not calculated in our first time in college.
We'll come up with several options for that next time.
And we'll let y'all select one.
Yes.
It
So we
seems
don't
to me
get out of-
undergraduate enrollment is more relevant to what we're trying to do. I think so.
That we do have master's degrees in our completion goal.
Take it back a little.
That's absolutely true.
Which raises one
Yes.
question that I had about because we break it down in here by degrees at some point, and so how do we handle that as far as the 60%? In other words, we've got 550,000 completions, which includes master's degrees, PhDs, professional degrees. Obviously, all those already have a bachelor's degree. So, and maybe it doesn't matter on the 550, but it does matter the 60%, because I think the 60%, we're just saying it is a individual with an attainment, a post-secondary attainment. If you have multiple attainments, that still only counts as one.
Correct.
So would that be correct that the 550 actually has?
We looked at the overlap of completions, and so that 550 takes that into account to get the 60%.
Yes.
When we
Okay. So
looked at
the
that.
550 does have someone gets a master's degree, they've always got a bachelor's. They're part of the 550, but they still only count as one person in the 60% goal.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Yes. And we did provide you with the document that links the completion goal, that 550, to the 60%. I think it was at the last meeting or a couple of meetings ago. We'd be happy to provide that again so you can look at how it breaks out.
Did you want to walk through the strategies that you guys have previously proposed for the completion goal? So the first was to scale up and share practices. This is the one I think Kathy was referring to, sort of the generic.
It's crime. It's so generic.
Okay. So why don't you take a few minutes, look through the 9 of these, and does one of them in particular say to you that this is something we really need to put some efforts into? And this represents your work.
Raymond, as far as possible strategies on completion that we're looking at here, how do you envision in a final report? Do we need to have a fiscal note on possible strategies? Some of which could be a money saver, for example, on block scheduling, et cetera, or trying to reduce the number of hours that are being used, but others that obviously college advising is a direct cost of having more advisors. How does that fit into the report is when we get into strategies that can have fiscal implications to it?
I would discourage attaching fiscal notes. I think we should indicate, as we did in closing the gaps, indicate that there are costs associated with significantly increasing your productivity in higher education, and we might give some examples of what some costs would be. But
should we maybe categorize them in terms of strategies that are cost reducing and strategies that are going to increase cost?
Well, I think we should do a little of both. I think we should probably indicate where we're likely to have to make significantly higher investments, and identify ways that you can get better results without investing much more money. I wouldn't suggest putting this in the report, but we know, for example, that if professors take role in class, that increases retention dramatically. That doesn't cost anything. That's just sound educational policy.
Okay, so
but would we label it? Thinking of a political document that we want to go to the legislature, would we label the following as no cost, but it's a way of by increasing retention, presumably that increases completion, lowers the cost per degree. Now, that maybe wouldn't reduce overall cost, but it does reduce the cost per degree, and we could categorize that, at least I could, as a cost saving.
David's dying to say something else. I'll defer to him.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
He probably wants to say something before I say something that he would contradict.
No comment. The board agreed that we would structure this plan in the way that we did with closing the gaps. That is, we set out broad goals. We set some directions in terms of strategy, but we still allow some, in fact, latitude on the part of institutions in terms of how to achieve some of these things. And so, I mentioned at the last meeting we didn't mention graduation rates, but graduation rates have gone up dramatically because of a number of things institutions have done despite more poor students. To do some of these things will exact some costs, but some of these things we will have to follow up with a strategy to really determine exactly how they might be done. And some of these are, when we're talking about strategies, they're more broad statewide type aspects, not individual institution things. So an institution might do something such as was just suggested, and another institution might approach it another way. The real goal is we want more completions. How are some ways we might do this? So, for example, we have guided pathways. We've heard about those, prior learning assessments, and competency-based models. We know that in other locations they can save money, they can save time, but they're not cost-free. And part of it depends on how you develop it, and part of it is once you develop a base, then there isn't really additional cost. But the reality is, I would argue that any type of change results in some cost. And it may be cheaper in the long term, but there is cost to change, and I think would be mistaken to not recognize that. And I think what the plan really should be doing is setting the best course of direction for the state. And then with some of the strategies, then you're allowing the opportunity to weigh in. For example, I think the classic example of that in this plan, if we stay with it, is the suggestion that we think about how to fundamentally redesign higher education funding. Nobody in this committee is suggesting how to do that. It may be, in fact, when we do that, as has been suggested, there might not be a fundamentally better way, but it may inform what we're doing to a greater extent, but a way that includes capital spending includes the concept of student cost, not just the cost per course, into more of an integrated model that's more effective. We don't know what that is at this point. So I think right now, I don't know that, there's real costs associated with this. Here's the real costs associated with closing the gaps. We know that. There's just the fact of having 600,000 more students, even though we're not paying as much for courses we would like, but you multiply that 54,000 in terms of another 600,000 students, that's a lot of money. You look at $3 billion that was put in to Texas grants since the inception of closing the gaps. That's real money. These are things that the dollars were not laid out specifically in closing the gaps, but these things came to be because the plan caused people to focus on how do we get there and how is it important to do. And when you go too far into the depths of putting dollars on things, then you give people reasons to start picking it apart piece by piece and not doing it. The key is it important to have more completions? Is it important to keep student debt down? Is it important to have marketable skills? If so, how do we do it? What's the best way to do it? And then when you do that, what's the most cost-efficient way to do it? But you want more people to be involved in the building of that than I think this group.
I mean,
that's my comment.
If you focused on strategies that were going to increase completion, even though they might cost some dollars, the trade-off would be if they increase completions at a rate greater than their incremental expenditure, the average cost of the completions would come down. So I'm just saying, as a strategy, should we have a group of strategies that, while they might have some incremental cost. Some of them, like the example of class attendance. I mean, I guess you could argue that has no cost, or maybe it has a very marginal cost. But if the data shows they drive completions, any strategies that drive the completion rate higher, should we try to package those as cost savings?
One of the things, I just mentioned this to David, one of the things you might want to take a look at is lowering, as a goal, is lowering the cost of a degree. That would suggest much higher levels of efficiency. The cost of a degree in Texas is quite high. Yeah. Well, and that's because so many students don't complete.
Well, there's that chart, and I've mentioned it before, where in Texas for $100,000, which includes state and tuition, you get 1.8 degrees. In Colorado and in Florida, 2.9 to 3 degrees. So in our efficiencies in our public research universities and our regional universities, you actually get slightly more degrees per $100,000 than you do in the community colleges because of the much higher completion rate, which is essentially, that data reinforces what we're talking about, is if you can push the completion rate higher at a cost that's incrementally less, you can actually you can bend the cost curve and actually has a goal, a lower cost per degree.
Well, we part of this, I guess we need to address it in text, but under the student debt goal, there is a target which says decreases semester credit hours that students attempt when completing an associate or bachelor's degree to within these semester credit hours, and it mentions the number. That directly gets at the cost. It doesn't say we're going to spend so much, but if you reduce it with associate degrees, now on average people are attempting 90 plus hours for a 60-some hour degree. So that you'd reduce the cost of that degree by half if you achieve this target, for example. And if that's reflected in the overall goal, I mean, one could develop some sort of background material that would point out if you achieve this by achieving the other, it would, in effect, reduce the cost of the state and the student by a considerable amount.
I mean, when you're in business, you think about the cost per widget. Whatever I can do to drop the cost, push the cost of the widget down. And in a public sense, you take a different view because you're thinking, what are the total dollars I'm expending? What I'm just suggesting here is that if we group our strategies and focus it on lowering the cost of the degree, maybe that's the focus, and it's less on the incremental cost of whatever the strategies are.
And I think estimating the cost of achieving the goals of this next strategic plan, it's enormously difficult to do this. Higher education is in such a state of flux right now. We don't know where competency-based instruction is going to end up 10, 15 years from now. We don't know if we're going to lower the cost of online education to levels substantially below those of face-to-face education. It's just impossible to predict. The technology, the delivery methods are still fairly primitive.
I think we could develop some background material to accompany the plan that could address how, we could go about doing this. But I think, when you put it in a context, at one hand, we're talking about reducing the cost to a degree. On the other hand, we're talking about we're making less investment than we were before. Part of this is a cost-benefit analysis, really. What are you going to spend to get the greater benefit? And I think can be, if we do what you've proposed in a number of things, you would keep the cost down. You would get greater benefit because you'd have more students completing in a shorter period of time. That's really what you're trying to do. And I think I'm just concerned about it making it appear to be all about cost efficiency. We've spent a decade talking about primarily cost efficiency, and I think we've actually are getting more graduates and we're spending less money. But I think at this point we need to really think about how can we make sure that we're getting how do we go to the next level of completion? How do we get more students out better prepared with less debt for the workload and within a population that's poorer, which means some of this is, however you want to characterize it, is you're going to have to subsidize some of that for our poor population.
And that's kind of where I was going, to be able to make the complete case that would argue for more investment to deal with economically disadvantaged, which is this growing percentage. Don't we have to couple that with, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, this is how we can become more efficient. We can lower the cost per degree at the same time that we need to expand Texas grants to deal with the income gap that is increasingly our largest barrier to the completion goal.
It sounds like what we need is some type of, at least an economic argument that we don't have here, which we really had in closing the gaps, which is this is a benefit to the state overall. It's not as though whether you believe in all parts of the population participating or not, if you believe in a prosperous state, all parts of the population have to participate. There's an economic benefit to that. And I think we can, some of this is so apparent to some of us who have been living this for a couple decades that it's obviously not coming out in what we're putting together. So we need to, I think, make a stronger argument for that than we have been. But I don't think it should be strictly a dollar argument, because I think that you don't want to fool people to think this is a free thing. It's not going to be inexpensive to do this, but in the long term, the state benefits. It may be that we need another piece of work like we had from Steve previously, which pointed out that if we didn't pursue this course, that the household incomes will go down by a dramatic amount of money, and that the tax revenues will, as a result, go down. And that really there's a...
And David, I think the leading, by choosing the 60% as kind of our attainment goal, as our leading goal, we're really sending the message that this is about economic development, it's about competitiveness, it's about quality of life for the state. And the question is, do you need to have interwoven in that strategies that are driven, that are focused on more efficiency? At the same time, you're building the case that we need to also invest more, and to get to the 60%, and that the rate of return on that should be would be is an appropriate incentive or appropriate return for the incremental investment. So it's more of it's a complete package, and it's not all about cost savings, but it's about competitiveness. It's about being more efficient by lowering the cost of per degree, because we've got more efficiencies. We've adopted better policies, and that seems to me is the precursor that sets the stage for the ask that says that we're also going to need to invest more, because our student population and their capacity, their relative capacity, has changed.
One of the comments that I'd make is when we talk about cost of degree, we also have to identify cost to whom. Is it cost to the student, or is it cost to the state, or how do we want to formulate that particular element? Because when we get to talking about student debt, now we're talking about the cost to the student, whereas some of these other things are what the state essentially appropriates or invests in that particular degree.
Larry?
Yeah, I'd want to follow up what Bob said. I think what you're driving at, Woody, and what David has discussed, is really producing more degrees, getting more success for the dollars we're spending from the state. What I'd like to be sure we don't get to is conveying the message that if only the colleges and universities would just lower their per hour costs, we would be at success point, because that's not going to happen. And I think we can't convey that kind of message with lowering the cost of degrees as a primary goal. We can't. The institutions can't be expected to produce something out of nothing.
That's right. If we get students in the college prepared, and we go from right now, the 6-year graduation rates at universities is just, as we know, hit 60%. If it hits 70%, we've decreased our cost right there, because right now we're not getting anything out of that, or at least not what we want out of that investment. And so part of the big message is we need people to be better prepared, and we need to attend to them once they're there, because it's much easier to work with them once they're enrolled in college than getting them there to begin with. And once they leave, they're very difficult to get back.
Right. Well, the macro message is accurate. And I can completely subscribe to the macro message. What I'm concerned about is it gets translated in the political world,
right,
too.
Yeah.
Price is charged to an individual student.
Yeah, we would spend more money, we would get more degrees, and if we get more degrees than the incremental expenditure, then we're more efficient.
Right.
And hopefully that's how you package that to be successful as far as getting support.
Let me ask a little bit of a philosophical question, I guess, and that is, am I entitled to a campus experience if someone else is toting my note? I mean, to me, an online, degree, perhaps competency-based or paced, would be something that we need to make available to anyone wanting to go to college at no cost, and be done with the cost factor. I mean, I'm getting a little bit controversial here, but so be it.
You're getting close to a dramatic strategy that Kathy was mentioning.
From a student life person, I don't like that.
Just an interesting note, online has caught up with us more than we realize, and not in the way you've mentioned, but I asked staff for a number on how many students were taking an online course. It was probably a year ago now, and that previous spring, a third of our students were actually took at least one online course that semester of all our students enrolled. And I think a lot of people don't realize the extent to which online has a current existing impact with students.
Just as a point of reference, I don't necessarily trust their rankings all that much, but U.S. News and World Reports now ranks online programs, and it's impressive to see how many Texas programs are ranked highly. So whatever is happening in online education, Texas is doing quite well at it.
So would you like to propose a specific strategy, Bernie?
Well, I'd like to make a motion.
Strategy number 3 under completion does talk about competency-based models and how an institution may choose to implement that.
I just think it would be beneficial to to Texas economically to make a competency-based online education available to anyone who wants to go to college.
Well, that's the case now. We've got Western Governors University, Texas, which is intended precisely to do that.
Exactly. I serve on the advisory board, and they're doing a great job.
I think
really
so.
are.
We need to do that. We need to do that with a GED program too. You know, there's no way that we can educate everybody that needs a GED with live instruction with faculty members in the classroom.
Right.
You've got to reach out using new technology. You got to do it online, and you got to use the internet.
Unfortunately,
Television, live television.
Unfortunately, a lot of the studies have shown that for those people that do need a GED or developmental ed, that online is one of the least effective ways for them to learn. So,
is that online of old or online of
current
new?
online?
Current online.
The data are pretty clear on this. That online education works for best for high achieving students, works for well prepared students, works for mature students.
Highly motivated students.
Is that?
Highly motivated.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
Now, they have found that what they call hybrid, where you're in the classroom part of the time and online part of the time, so you do get a little bit of that cost savings from the online portion, but that it has been proven to be much more effective.
And there really isn't cost savings to that, because you're rather than lecturing, you're using online materials, and you're increasing classroom discussion, so you're being more you're having more intense classroom activities through that. But now that you've heard that, you still may have a proposal. I know, for example, I mean, we're talking about masters as well. I just learned that both of my cousins' daughters who work for the Department of Defense are completing online master's programs. But they're highly motivated. They were summa cum laude folks from their schools, but
Probably expecting to get a raise when they complete it.
they actually got a raise before completing it. But they will complete.
We would be remiss if we didn't mention that the Texas Affordable Baccalaureate program, where Texas A&M University Commerce has a fully online competency-based programs that they're ramping up now, and it's a flat fee, $750 for 7 weeks, and you can take as many competency-based courses in that 7 weeks that you can manage as a student, so your pace is dictated by yourself. And also South Texas College is ramping up their Texas Affordable Baccalaureate degree, where it's competency-based. So we already have some plans in action, but again, if you have an idea for embellishment or a funding model or a donation you would like to make, we are all ears.
And maybe we do fund some hand-holding along the way. I mean, with the Texas Western Governors University, of course, they've got a mentor at your side the whole journey, and they've got subject matter experts you can call at 3 a.m. in the morning if you hit a snag. So maybe we could remedy that issue that you talked about, where the undermotivated students don't perform as well online. Maybe we could remedy that with some level of offset investment.
Yeah, I think that one thing that hasn't been mentioned is that we did visit with, I don't recall, Raymond, I think you invited them, but maybe it was someone from DeVry who seemed to have some effectiveness with developmental ed online, but the difference is they actually had very active faculty involved with it. They were actually monitoring everything they did, and so one can do some things like that, but it's not really cheaper to do it. And so, but it does address an access standpoint, but there's got to be somebody there who, it's almost more of a tutoring situation, because they're saying, you know, Bernie, you didn't get your work done. You haven't been online for 2 days. I can say I actually had an administrative assistant who enrolled in the South Texas A&M Commerce program, and before she left for another job, she had received several phone calls from A&M Commerce about her work. So it was very helpful to her in that she had completed a lot of hours and would not be on the road to finishing if not for that. And that's one thing you haven't brought up, is this notion of all those students who have invested a lot of money in, and that they are referenced here in another place, but who have not finished their degrees, and they're somewhere within a year and a half of completing, but left for some reason. Either, you know, in the case of the tech industry, a lot of people left because they got good job offers, and then when layoffs came, they were the first to be laid off. In other cases, you know, there are family factors that enter in and cause them to leave and get back. But I'm saying this because you've come up with an idea, and we were sort of slamming you with all the reasons not to do it, and I'm just trying to see if there's some strategy here that we need to build on. It's really important for you guys to identify some key strategies that you think will work.
I wonder if we have. We don't have a. Texas is now and probably will always be a low taxation state. So really, do we have a choice but to devise a workaround in terms of the efficiency and the costing of college? I don't know any other way. I mean, I can't go to the legislature and say, hey, thou shalt not be a low tax state anymore. I mean, so we're going to have to do something.
I mean, one could say, are there things that we're ignoring that we could learn from the for-profit industry? People assume that some of these places are all online, but they're not really. Phoenix has locations all over the state. One of the early ones, Nova, actually had clusters where they would actually hire faculty from public universities to meet with students in Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio on a monthly basis. There are things which were done where they still maintain some of the contact with students that can be important, but we tend to look at it as an all or nothing approach. Either it's online or it's not online, and you know, it's like, you know, the blended is really something that can help a traditional education enhance it, but you still have people in the classroom talking about things and working with a faculty member.
David, we've got about 15 minutes,
Going once, going twice, opportunity for a big breakthrough strategy.
I'd like to talk a little about marketable skills. Can we move to that?
Sure.
And may I make my one point, which is really that for the life of me, I don't see why it takes 15 years to do this. I've never understood why we can't. Really, I can't understand why we can't identify and implement by 2020, but I like the timetable you have here better in the new diagram. But I don't understand the 50%. Is that 50% identified?
That's 50% of the programs will have identified marketable skills.
So why don't they all have to just do this by 2020?
Right.
Let's do it.
We can certainly change that.
It doesn't seem to me, if we're going to put the emphasis on this, why does it take so long?
Well, I think I can tell you the reasoning, and it may be flawed, but the reasoning is we're trying to be sensitive to the spectrum of institutions who will be approaching this issue. You have some like TSDC who are there, and you have others like small community colleges or rural colleges that will have, starting from scratch, and will need help or support even figuring out how to do it. And we don't want to put a clamp on them for doing it right. We don't want something done quickly when if it takes we give them a little bit more time, it can be done better. And so, for example, staff had a call yesterday with someone from the University of Kent in England who has been working with marketable skills for a while. And we talked about the kinds of strategies they're using to make their students employable. They call them employability skills. And they have, it varies by program, but a lot of them use extracurricular modules that students complete online. And that's a really great way to introduce those skills into someone's list of competencies, as it were. But it takes time to build those modules and do that well. So I absolutely agree we can ramp this up to a faster timeline, but the reasoning behind it was to create space for those institutions who haven't even started with this.
Well, I personally would rather see us move and get it done by 2020 and then have 2 update cycles. I mean, I assume, to me, I don't see much risk in doing what you can do first and then improving it over time. I don't see why you have to take 10 years figuring out the perfect answer.
Well, we regularly get that response. So why don't we go with 100% and then we'll get feedback from the field.
Okay. Well, you've heard my...
Right. And David and I had talked about that, and I think that was reflected since our last meeting here where you were getting more of it done by 2025.
And we were wanting to make clear, too, that you don't do it once and it's done forever. And so I like the language you had, is that there's a cycle. Some of these things are going to change and modify, and what is appropriate in 2020 may not be as useful, or at least in 2030. Supply chain management was pretty much unheard of 8 years ago. Now it's virtually every school that has a management program has at least a course, if not a program in it. And you'd be derelict now if you didn't provide some skills in that. So that's the type of thing that you have to be aware of and need to have a process in place. So we can do that.
Well, not only that, I mean, the institutions are going to figure out how to do it better by doing it the first time.
That's true.
If you encourage them to think about it longer, you aren't going to get a better result.
That's true. We should usually only have 5 committee meetings.
David, this is just a wording issue. I'm trying to figure out who's going to put forward programs that are going to identify programs that do not have marketable skills. What university would want to identify their programs that do not have marketable skills, so that if you by default, if I'm not listed as a marketable skill program, I don't teach anything that's got marketable skills. I mean, it could be like chemistry or something like that they couldn't sell.
And then I have to say,
I'm sorry.
Open disclosure, we've talked about, assuming this gets here, that we need to modify our program proposal to show that schools need to explicitly say what are their marketable skills in their program when they submit them for approval.
Perhaps what components of their programs
are marketable?
Contain marketable skills or something. Because if you put this out to most universities, they're going to find it's going to go out to every department head, and they're going to say, we can't not have marketable skills. So you're going to get marketable skills all over the place. And maybe if you soften this a little bit, you'd actually get marketable skills instead of what I reconstructed marketable skills.
Well, I do think, I don't know if we have it in the strategies, but we've talked about, we have it. If you look, we added a blue strategy, convene as advisory group to identify general characteristics of institutional and program quality. This advisory group that's for something else. But we talked about defining a framework for marketable skills. I mean, what type of things are we talking about so that everybody doesn't do the same thing, but here at least are is sort of the types of things we're talking about, and give some examples of things that probably are there that they don't realize. And part of it, too, is that they need to begin to talk to their students about these when they enter the doors and not wait for them to go to the placement office when they're leaving. And
well, the institutions are already on this. They're already moving on.
That's right.
It. So our role is not to start them. Our role is to encourage them. Yeah. And I think we ought to encourage them to a faster timetable than
that's right. And
we previously discussed.
We do have a document that is being revised once again on marketable skills, and I think one thing that was encouraging is that having identified a number of things that schools in Texas are already currently working on as guidance to other people. So,
yes, Lori.
A comment that ties into that and also to the first two strategies, potential strategies for completion. And that is with House Bill 5, all of the public schools, K-12, are already working on these 2 points, and that is, supporting academic preparation for students and letting them know what courses and what majors and what interests. They're already doing that right now, and they're scrambling to do it. I dare say probably, the majority of them are scrambling to try and figure out how to implement House Bill 5. And this would be a good partnership right now. I mean, the timing would be perfect as they are unveiling the implementation strategies for each of those districts.
Good point.
Why don't we take a few minutes and just talk organizationally? David, you sent out a draft to Larry and I of the plan. I've given you my comments. I don't know whether you had a chance to. So what's your thought as far as taking in our discussion today, reflecting whatever impact that might have on the plan, and are we ready to release it to the committee and begin? We're sitting here in February, but we've got a March, April, May, June. I'm assuming and I think right now we're scheduled for an early July final meeting, and then the coordinating board approval on around the 23rd or so of July.
Yes.
So we've got a few more inputs coming, particularly that we'll have the governor's representatives at the next. It's going to be probably more and more committee discussion like today, and fewer inputs as we drive toward a final product.
And we need to get that same draft we give the committee to the board for them to have a chance to see it early on. And we do need to get it out to the general public with understanding that they should have the opportunity to provide some feedback to that document. So it will be should be understood that draft will be modified before it goes to the board in July, but we need to get some broader input from just the committee.
You don't want to be blindsided,
right? No. But no, we will. But we'll probably need to share it with the board as a draft about the same time we share it with the committee, understanding that you guys haven't had a chance. They've asked about that. Another aspect of this is I know that it's probably time that the board hear from either the chair or vice chair an update, and I know you'll be gone in April, so we could either have the share it with our board committee, which meets in March, just an update on where we are, and have one or both of you there, or if Larry's able to come to April, have it at the board committee itself, but we need to discuss that with you because they haven't been able to sort of hear from you directly. Your thoughts, they just hear from me, and you don't want everything channeled through me. That's dangerous.
So the March meeting, we'll have staff members from the governor's office.
And we're inviting Senator Seliger and Zerwas, Representative Zerwas, to talk about their interim report.
Okay.
We don't know if they'll come. And then we will continue this discussion. We'll have much more detail as you've asked, and Steve has volunteered. We're going to talk to him later in the week about some background material.
When we receive an update on some of the data that's been collected or what you had on the graph under completion that we didn't have, right? I mean, it's not in this packet.
Right.
probably because I'm like slower than slow, it would be helpful to me if everything is grouped together. So anything relative to completion or the various goals or strategies that are impacted by this information we don't have that y'all have or going to get, if that all follows so that we're not going between charts, individual comments, and then another enclosure on I just think you'd get a more thoughtful response if we could review everything relative to a particular goal and strategies in one place and move on.
Now, one thing we could do, if you would like, in terms of the process, I believe Ramona has made some changes based upon your comments to me. We could go ahead and share that draft with everyone here before we share it with the board if you wanted to speed the process, and then be in the process of incorporating the comments from today.
Okay.
If you wanted to do that, we could do that immediately.
Yeah.
Is that fair, Ramona? Chief says grudgingly yes. Larry looks concerned.
That's a draft as evolved by today's discussion.
Well, no, Woody had given me comments probably 5 days ago, I guess, and so we've incorporated some of those comments. We could share that draft with everyone here prior to making the comments changes from today, or if you wanted to, so we'd make all the changes at once or comments at once, or we could wait to incorporate today's discussion and send it out, whatever is your preference. I think, how long would it take to incorporate the comments from today? 2 days? How many? 3 days? Okay.
Sounds reasonable to me, Frank.
Okay.
My sense is it would be more useful to the committee to have it reflect today's discussion.
Right.
Okay, we'll do. We'll get that done in 3 days and get it to you.
Now, if you could have
Thanks,
it out within the week, and then give everybody 2 weeks to reply, and then we'd still have another week before we had our next meeting. So.
Okay. Appreciate the look on your face.
Okay, any other comments? We're kind of at the end of our meeting, and we try to stay and finish on time, so any other comments? I mean, as you can see today, and I think, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, I think this is maybe more a prototype of what we'll see, is where we're going to have more and more committee discussion with staff. Still input, but probably declining input as we wind toward a final product here.
We had to have this type of meeting today. This is sort of, what if we wrought type meeting today and realize it's getting close to this is going to have your name on it pretty soon, and you need to be comfortable with what's here.
Okay, meeting adjourned. Thank you once again.
Glad you were able to make the end part of the meeting.
What about Michael?